Good evening. Tonight, I'll be sharing a few true crime stories told in a calm and steady way, perfect for listening as you drift off to sleep. In this episode, we'll revisit the tragic case of Chris Watts, explore the capture of the Golden State Killer, uncover the mystery of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, and look into the enigma of the Somerton man. Make yourself comfortable and let these stories guide you into the night. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. Chris Watts was, at first glance, the image of a quiet, unassuming man. He was soft-spoken, polite, and rarely the center of attention. Those who knew him described him as dependable, perhaps even reserved, but always steady. He grew up in North Carolina in a modest household and carried with him a calm demeanor that would later become part of how people remembered him. Chris was fascinated by cars and engines, a passion that stayed with him into adulthood. He spent many hours learning how things worked mechanically, often happiest in the garage or under the hood of a vehicle. Shanann, on the other hand, was different in almost every respect. Born in North Carolina as well, she was energetic, social, and determined. Her friends would later describe her as someone who could light up a room, a woman who carried herself with a sense of purpose. Life had not always been easy for her. She faced health challenges and moments of uncertainty, but she was persistent. Shanann was ambitious, and she poured her energy into building not only a career, but also a sense of identity that was rooted in hard work and resilience. Their paths crossed at a time when both were seeking something stable. Shanann met Chris through mutual connections, and from the very beginning, she would later say that she did not expect much from him. In fact, she initially thought he might not be the one to pursue. But Chris proved persistent in a quiet way, showing up for her when she needed support. When Shanann struggled with illness and long recoveries, Chris remained close, steady, and dependable. This quiet consistency drew her in. She would later reflect that he had seen her at her lowest moments and still chose to stay. That foundation became a cornerstone of their relationship. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The two married in 2012. Their wedding was modest but meaningful, and from the outside, it seemed like a new beginning. Not long after, they settled into suburban life in Colorado, purchasing a home in Frederick, a growing town north of Denver. The house was spacious, with room for a family, and it symbolized the life they were building together. In 2013, their first daughter, Bella, was born. Friends and relatives remember Shanann throwing herself into motherhood with the same energy she had always carried in other parts of her life. Bella was quiet, thoughtful, and sweet, often shy but affectionate. She became the center of their small world. 2 years later, their second daughter, Celeste, often called Ceci, was born. She was more spirited, full of energy, and had a mischievous side that balanced her sister's gentler personality. Together, the family of four seemed complete, the picture of stability in a suburban neighborhood. Behind the surface, however, the Watts household carried the same challenges as many young families: financial strain, the demands of raising children, and the adjustments that come when two very different personalities share a life. Chris remained quiet, often preferring routines and small comforts. Shanann, in contrast, was active on social media, frequently sharing glimpses of their family life, the milestones of her children, and the affection she had for her husband. To outsiders, their relationship appeared warm and affectionate. Photos showed smiling faces, coordinated family outfits, and moments of domestic happiness. Yet beneath those images, tensions began to grow. Finances were a recurring source of stress. The couple had invested in their home and carried significant debt, a reality that often weighed heavily on Shanann. She worked hard to supplement their income, including becoming involved in a company that sold health and lifestyle products. This role not only gave her a sense of purpose, but also allowed her to maintain the social connections she valued so deeply. Chris supported her, though his nature remained less public, less outgoing. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The differences in their personalities, her extroversion and his introversion, began to create subtle but noticeable divides. Friends sometimes observed that Chris seemed withdrawn at gatherings, quiet to the point of near invisibility, while Shanann was always the center of conversation. Still, no one suspected anything was deeply wrong. Most saw them as simply a couple with different temperaments, managing life together in their own way. As years passed, Shanann continued to pour energy into her career and family. She frequently traveled for work, attending events and conferences, often taking the girls with her or leaving them in Chris's care. On social media, she highlighted Chris's role as a loving father, portraying him as attentive, playful, and dedicated. To all appearances, Chris was a supportive husband who took pride in his family. But beneath that surface, something was shifting. By 2018, Chris had begun to change. Those close to Shanann noticed he appeared more distant, more focused on himself, even physically different. He had lost weight, become more conscious of his appearance, and seemed to carry himself differently. Shanann, though often optimistic, confided to friends that she worried something was wrong. She wondered if stress was wearing on him, or if he was simply pulling away. At times, she tried to confront these feelings directly, asking Chris if something was bothering him. His responses were usually calm and quiet, reassuring her that everything was fine. During the summer of 2018, Shanann spent several weeks visiting family in North Carolina with the children. Chris stayed behind in Colorado, citing work responsibilities. It was during this time that the distance between them grew even sharper. Shanann noticed that his communication became sporadic, less affectionate, and sometimes even cold. Friends she spoke to during the trip later recalled that she was worried. She told them she felt something was wrong in her marriage, though she could not fully understand what. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. When she returned to Colorado in early August, she hoped that reconnecting in person would help. She was also carrying another secret. She was pregnant with their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. Shanann believed that this new addition would bring joy and renewal to their family. She told Chris about the pregnancy with excitement, expecting that it would bring them closer together. His reaction, however, was more muted than she anticipated. He seemed distracted, distant and less engaged. Still, Shanann pressed forward, continuing to focus on her work, her children, and the home they had built. She documented moments on social media, shared updates with friends, and tried to maintain a sense of stability. But the unease lingered, and privately she confided her growing concerns. She noticed Chris withdrawing not only emotionally, but also physically, and she began to fear that there was more to his behavior than stress or fatigue. As the summer moved into its final weeks, the tension in their household quietly deepened. To those outside, life appeared steady. The girls played, the family attended events, and Shanann remained active online. But within the walls of their Colorado home, the dynamic had shifted. Chris seemed to live at a slight distance from his own life, quieter than usual and increasingly difficult to read. Shanann's instincts told her that something was wrong, but she continued to hope that with time and communication, they could recover the closeness they once had. It was in this quiet but fragile balance that August 2018 began. Neither Chris nor Shanann could have known that the weeks ahead would unravel their lives entirely. In the early hours of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home to Colorado after a business trip. A close friend had driven her from the airport to her house in Frederick. It was just after 1:30 in the morning when she quietly carried her suitcase to the front door. Chris had stayed home with the girls while she was away. By all accounts, the return was uneventful, the kind of small, routine moment that passes unnoticed in most households. Nothing about it suggested that it would be the last time anyone outside of that home would see Shanann alive. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The next day, her friend grew concerned when Shanann did not respond to text messages or calls. This was unusual. Shanann was known for being responsive, always quick to reply, especially given that she had 2 small children and was expecting a third. She had also scheduled a doctor's appointment that morning to check on her pregnancy, something she was unlikely to miss or forget. When her friend realized that the silence was stretching longer than it should, She decided to go to the Watts home to check on her. Arriving at the house, she knocked and rang the doorbell. There was no answer. The blinds remained drawn, and the quiet suburban street gave no indication of activity inside. Shanann's car was still parked in the garage, which struck her as odd. If she had left, the car would have been gone. Slowly, her concern deepened. She called Chris, who at the time was at work. He tried to reassure her over the phone, but she remained unsettled. Eventually, she contacted the police to request a welfare check. When officers arrived, they were met with a calm but unsettling scene. The house was quiet, locked, and still. Chris soon returned from work to meet them there. His demeanor was subdued, almost detached, though at first this did not raise alarm. He allowed the officers to enter the home. Inside, they found Shanann's belongings, her purse, her phone, her medications, all left behind. These were not items she would normally abandon, especially with 2 young children to care for. The discovery raised immediate concern. The officers asked Chris about his family's whereabouts. He told them that Shanann had said she was taking the girls to visit a friend, though he did not provide specific details. The explanation did not fully align with what the police were seeing. Shanann's car was still in the garage. The children's car seats were inside as well. For anyone familiar with parenting young children, this detail stood out. Leaving without car seats would make travel nearly impossible. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Outside, a neighbor who lived next door offered the officers access to his home surveillance footage. His system had captured movement from the Watts driveway in the early morning hours. On the recording, they saw Chris backing his truck into the driveway, loading items into it, and then driving away. The neighbor remarked that this behavior was unusual. Chris never parked his truck in that manner, and the timing struck him as odd. He told the officers that Chris seemed different that day, more animated than usual, pacing and talking in a way that stood out from his typically quiet personality. As investigators began piecing together these small but significant details, Chris's story seemed increasingly thin. Still, the police did not yet know what had happened. Missing person cases are often complex, with many potential explanations. For the moment, all they could confirm was that Shanann and the 2 girls were gone, their belongings left behind, and that the last person to see them was Chris. Over the next 24 hours, the case gained momentum. News outlets began reporting on the disappearance of a young mother and her 2 daughters, framing it as a mystery that had shaken a quiet Colorado community. Family and friends joined in the search, pleading for information and urging anyone with knowledge to come forward. Chris also spoke to the media, giving interviews outside his home. In them, he expressed concern for his family, though observers noted that his tone seemed strangely flat. He stood in front of the cameras, arms crossed, voice calm, almost matter-of-fact, as he described wanting them to come home. Some who watched felt sympathy, believing him to be a worried husband. Others felt an unease they could not quite explain. Police, meanwhile, began focusing more closely on Chris himself. They asked him to come in for questioning, a routine part of such an investigation. He agreed. In interviews, he presented himself as cooperative. He described his last interactions with Shanann, telling officers that they had a brief but emotional conversation about the state of their marriage. According to him, she had suggested he might be pulling away from her. He admitted that the marriage was under strain, but framed it as an ordinary argument, nothing out of the ordinary for couples under stress. He denied knowing where she or the girls had gone. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. At the same time, detectives began interviewing Shanann's friends and family. Many of them quickly voiced suspicions. They described Shanann as a devoted mother who would never leave her children voluntarily. They also highlighted her excitement about the new pregnancy and her dedication to maintaining stability. For those who knew her, the idea that she had simply left without a word was unthinkable. Investigators also began piecing together details of the Watts' relationship. Through phone records, digital communications, and testimony from those close to the family, they discovered that the marriage was indeed under strain. What they did not yet know was just how deep those fractures ran. In the days that followed, the search for Shanann and the children expanded. Volunteers canvassed nearby areas, officers coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions, and the media continued to cover the story extensively. The image of Shanann, smiling beside her daughters, appeared on television screens and online news outlets nationwide. With each passing day, the pressure on Chris increased. Investigators noticed his behavior carefully. At times he appeared cooperative, but he also seemed emotionally distant. In interviews, his answers were short, sometimes inconsistent. His body language shifted under pressure, and though he attempted to present a calm exterior, subtle cracks began to show. Detectives trained to notice such signs grew more certain that Chris knew more than he was admitting. One significant breakthrough came when they asked Chris to take a polygraph test. Though not admissible in court as definitive proof, polygraphs can be a valuable investigative tool, often used to gauge a suspect's credibility. Chris agreed to take the test, perhaps believing he could manage his composure. The results, however, indicated deception. When confronted with this outcome, the investigators pressed him further. In a calm but direct manner, they told him that the time had come to be honest. Chris initially resisted, repeating that he did not know where his family was. But as the pressure mounted, his story began to shift. Finally, in a private conversation with his father, who had come to the station to support him, Chris made a partial admission. He said that Shanann was dead, though he framed the events differently than they had occurred. He claimed that he were taken from her in a moment of anger after supposedly witnessing her harming their children. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. This statement stunned investigators, not because they believed it, but because it revealed the first real admission of involvement. Detectives recognized the explanation as an attempt to deflect blame. The story he told did not align with the evidence they had already gathered, but it was a turning point. For the first time, Chris had acknowledged that he knew his family was gone and that he was directly responsible. Even with this partial confession, investigators proceeded carefully. They continued to search for Shanann and the girls, determined to locate them and bring clarity to the case. On August 16th, just 3 days after the initial missing persons report, the search came to a tragic end. Shanann's body was found buried in a shallow grave on property owned by the oil company where Chris worked. The bodies of Bella and Celeste were discovered nearby, hidden inside oil tanks. The discovery was devastating, but it confirmed what many had already feared. The story that had begun as a missing persons case was now a violent death investigation, and Chris Watts was the central figure. For the community, the realization was shocking. This quiet, seemingly ordinary family in a suburban neighborhood had become the focus of a crime that would soon capture national attention. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike struggled to reconcile the image of a smiling father with the reality of what had been uncovered. As the investigation deepened, detectives began reconstructing the timeline of events in painstaking detail. Their goal was not only to prove what had happened, but also to understand why. The answers, as they soon discovered, lay not only in physical evidence, but in the complex psychological layers of a man who had lived a double life, and in the fractures of a marriage that had once seemed secure. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. When investigators looked closer at Chris Watts's life in the summer of 2018, one detail stood out almost immediately. His sudden changes in appearance and demeanor, the weight loss, the new attention to grooming and fitness, all of these were classic indicators that something in his personal life had shifted. For friends and family, the change seemed vague, almost difficult to define, but for detectives, it pointed to the possibility of another relationship. Through phone records, financial statements, and interviews, they began piecing together the quiet existence Chris had been leading outside his home. At the center of this discovery was a woman named Nicole Kessinger. She was a co-worker at the oil company where Chris was employed, and their connection had grown quickly over the summer months. To those around them, it was a relationship largely hidden, though in retrospect, the signs had been present all along. Nicole described Chris As someone who had presented himself as a man whose marriage was ending, a person in transition rather than a husband and father, still firmly rooted in family life. He spoke to her about separating from Shanann, about the difficulties of his relationship, and about the possibility of a new beginning. For Nickel, these words created an image of a man who was quietly moving forward, preparing to rebuild his life. She later told investigators that she had believed him, that he had seemed honest, even gentle. As detectives compared Chris's words to Shanann's accounts, the contrast was stark. Shanann had confided to her friends that she sensed him pulling away, that she feared there might be someone else, but she had not fully confirmed it. For her, the concern remained a suspicion, a feeling that something was wrong. For investigators, however, it was becoming clear. Chris had been living two lives. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The affair did not in itself prove guilt, but it offered context. It revealed motive, or at least the possibility of one. In many violent death investigations, the presence of a new relationship becomes a key factor. It suggests not only dissatisfaction in the marriage, but also a reason for deception, secrecy, and in rare but devastating cases, violence. Detectives returned to their interviews with Chris, armed with this knowledge. They asked him about his relationship with Nickel. At first, he denied it, but when presented with evidence from phone records and text messages, he admitted that there was indeed another woman in his life. He described it as a relationship that had grown over the summer, something he insisted had not influenced his marriage as much as it might appear. But for investigators, the link was undeniable. The picture that emerged was not of a man who had suddenly snapped in a moment of uncontrollable rage, but of someone who had carefully maintained two realities. On one side, the public image of a devoted father and husband. On the other, a secret life in which he spoke of freedom, of a fresh start, and of the possibilities of a future unburdened by responsibilities. Psychologists who later studied the case pointed to the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. Chris, they argued, was attempting to reconcile two irreconcilable identities. The strain of maintaining both, the quiet family man and the man pursuing a new relationship, created a pressure that he was unwilling to resolve in honest, constructive ways. Instead of confrontation, he chose concealment. Instead of truth, he relied on deception. And in time, those patterns escalated into actions that would destroy everything around him. Investigators noticed how Chris reacted when confronted with these contradictions. Rather than anger or visible distress, he remained largely calm. His voice stayed steady, his demeanor collected. For seasoned detectives, this composure was telling. It suggested not peace of mind, but control, a deliberate effort to manage his outward appearance, even as his internal world collapsed. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Meanwhile, Nickel, once she realized the full extent of what had happened, cooperated with law enforcement. She provided her phone records, her messages with Chris, and her recollections of their time together. In interviews, she expressed shock and devastation, emphasizing that she had never imagined he was capable of harming his family. Her willingness to speak added another layer of clarity, helping investigators trace Chris's movements and thoughts in the weeks leading up to August 13th. The evidence of the affair also reframed Shanann's final weeks. Friends recalled her worry, the late-night messages where she voiced her sense that Chris was slipping away from her. She had tried to reach him emotionally, to understand his distance, but had often been met with vague reassurances. Her optimism, her desire to believe that the pregnancy would renew their bond, now stood in tragic contrast to the reality that Chris had already begun planning a different life entirely. With this context, investigators deepened their analysis of Chris's statements. They compared his version of events to the physical evidence. His claim that Shanann had harmed the children before he acted did not align with forensic findings. The condition of the crime scenes, the timelines reconstructed from phone data, and the testimony of neighbors all pointed to a different sequence of events, one in which Chris had acted alone, deliberately, and without provocation. Still, the investigation remained methodical. Detectives avoided rushing conclusions, instead layering evidence piece by piece. They sought to understand not only the act itself, but the mindset behind it. Why had Chris chosen this path when other options, separation, divorce, honesty, were available? The answer, though complex, seemed rooted in his psychology. Experts later described him as someone whose identity was tied heavily to external perception. He had lived much of his life quietly, without drawing attention, content to exist in the background. His marriage to Shanann had placed him in a different light, often visible on social media, often portrayed in ways that did not align with his own self-image. While Shanann thrived in the spotlight, Chris receded further into himself. In this gap between public portrayal and private reality, he cultivated secrecy. The affair became not only a relationship, but a symbol of a new identity he could imagine for himself, one free of the pressures he felt at home. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Forensic psychologists observed that his decision-making reflected a form of compartmentalization. He separated his responsibilities as a father and husband from his desires as an individual, and in doing so, he created a split reality that eventually collapsed under its own weight. The crime, in this interpretation, was less about sudden passion and more about a desperate attempt to reconcile two incompatible lives. The investigation also revealed smaller but telling details. Chris's phone records showed patterns of communication with Nickel that grew more frequent in the days leading up to the disappearance. His searches online included topics related to starting a new life, even lyrics to songs about freedom and reinvention. These details, while seemingly minor, contributed to the broader narrative. Chris was not simply overwhelmed in a single moment, but rather moving steadily toward a catastrophic choice. As this picture came into focus, prosecutors prepared their case. The physical evidence, the confession, the testimony from Shannon's friends and family, and the revelations about the affair all combined into a story that was both tragic and compelling. Public attention on the case intensified. News outlets covered every detail, from the search for the family to the unfolding revelations about Chris's double life. For those watching from the outside, the case was both shocking and bewildering. How could someone who appeared so ordinary, so quiet, commit acts so extraordinary in their cruelty? Neighbors recalled seeing Chris playing with his daughters, Shanann sharing loving messages about him online, and the family appearing stable and happy. Reconciling those images with the reality of what had happened was difficult not only for the community, but for the nation at large. As the legal process moved forward, Chris eventually faced the decision of whether to go to trial or to accept responsibility through a legal plea. The weight of the evidence against him was overwhelming. The physical findings, his shifting stories, the revelations of his affair, and the recovery of the bodies all left little room for doubt. In the end, he chose to enter a guilty legal plea to multiple counts of the killing. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The legal plea spared him the death penalty, a decision made partly at the request of Shannon's family, who wished to avoid a prolonged and painful trial. Instead, Chris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, the sentence brought a measure of closure, though not of comfort. The reality of the crime, the loss of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn Nico could never truly be resolved. Yet, even after sentencing, the case continued to draw attention. Documentaries, books, and analyses sought to understand the psychology of Chris Watts. Experts debated whether his actions reflected hidden pathology, a sudden break, or a calculated attempt to erase one life in order to start another. Each perspective added layers to the story, but none could erase the central truth, that a man who appeared ordinary had chosen a path of extraordinary destruction. For investigators, the case stood as a reminder of the importance of small details. A neighbor's surveillance camera, a friend's intuition, a polygraph test, and the willingness of those close to the family to speak openly, all had contributed to the unraveling of Chris's deception. Piece by piece, the truth had emerged, not through dramatic revelations, but through steady, methodical work. And for those who followed the case, the image of Shanann remained central. Her optimism, her determination, and her devotion to her children stood in stark contrast to the choices that Chris had made. Her voice, preserved in messages and videos, continued to echo long after the case had concluded, reminding the world not only of the tragedy of her loss, but of the life she had lived before it was taken away. When Chris Watts entered his guilty legal plea in November of 2018, the courtroom was hushed. Family members, investigators, and members of the community sat silently, listening as the judge read the charges. The words fell heavily, one after another. The killing of Shannon, the killing of Bella, the killing of Celeste, the loss of the expected child. Each charge was read aloud, each met with Chris's quiet acknowledgement. He did not look around the courtroom. He did not address those who had once been closest to him. His voice was barely audible, steady but stripped of emotion as he confirmed his legal plea. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Let the moment rest, small truths linger in the hush. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. For Shannon's family, the hearing was both unbearable and necessary. They listened as prosecutors outlined the case, recounting the evidence and describing how Chris had betrayed his role as a husband and father. They heard again the details of how Shannon's life had ended, and how her daughters, so young and full of promise, had been taken from them. Yet, in the midst of this pain, Shannon's family made a decision that shaped the course of the legal proceedings. They asked that the death penalty not be pursued. Their reason was simple but profound. They did not want to prolong the suffering with years of appeals and trials. They wanted instead a conclusion. The judge agreed to the legal plea deal, sentencing Chris Watts to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to a maximum security facility where he would spend the remainder of his days. For many, the sentence felt appropriate, though no punishment could undo what had been done. The families left the courtroom knowing that justice, at least in the legal sense, had been served. Outside the courtroom, the world reacted with a mixture of sorrow, shock, and fascination. The story had drawn widespread attention, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the contrast between perception and reality. To neighbors, co-workers, and even casual acquaintances, Chris had seemed ordinary, perhaps even unremarkable. He was quiet, polite, and dependable. To those who followed Shannon's social media, the family appeared loving and close-knit. The dissonance between that image and the reality of the crime struck a chord with the public. Documentaries and news specials quickly followed. Some focused on the investigation, highlighting the careful work of law enforcement and the small details that had exposed Chris's lies. Others examined the psychology of the case, asking how a man with no significant criminal history could commit such acts. The footage of Chris's media interviews, given in the days before his confession, became iconic in their own way. Viewers scrutinized his body language, his calm tone, and his choice of words, searching for signs of deception. Many concluded that he had seemed strangely detached, his affect flat, his concern unconvincing. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. In the months after his sentencing, Chris's life inside prison settled into routine. He was placed in protective custody, both for his own safety and because of the notoriety of his case. Inmates convicted of crimes against children often face additional risks in prison populations. His days became structured, with scheduled meals, limited recreation time, and hours spent in his cell. Reports from those who interacted with him suggested that he remained quiet, often keeping to himself, and that he occasionally engaged with religious programs offered by the prison chaplaincy. Psychologists who studied the case emphasized the importance of understanding Chris not as a mystery, but as a person whose choices reflected underlying psychological dynamics. They described his need for external validation, his tendency toward passivity, and his inability to confront conflict directly. Instead of addressing marital difficulties honestly, he withdrew, concealed, and created a second life. When the tension between those lives became unbearable, his response was catastrophic. One aspect of the case that continued to fascinate both the public and professionals was Chris's demeanor throughout the investigation. From the first day officers entered his home, he remained unusually calm. His voice rarely rose. His answers were often brief. When he stood before the cameras to plead for his family's return, his arms were folded tightly across his chest, his eyes avoiding direct contact. Some interpreted this as guilt made visible. Others suggested it reflected a personality that had always been restrained, uncomfortable with emotional expression. The release of body camera footage from officers on the day Shanann was reported missing offered the public a detailed view of those early moments. Viewers could watch as the neighbor showed surveillance footage, as Chris shifted uneasily, as officers moved through the quiet house with its drawn blinds and silent rooms. These videos, intended as routine documentation, became central to how the case was understood by the public. They showed, in real time, the unraveling of Chris's story. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. For Shanann's friends and family, the loss remained immeasurable. They remembered her as someone full of life and determination, a woman who faced health challenges with resilience, who built a career with energy, and who devoted herself to her children. Her friends spoke of her optimism, her willingness to encourage others, and her ability to make people feel seen. In the years following her death, they worked to preserve her memory, sharing stories and continuing to post tributes that emphasized her strength and her love. The case also sparked broader conversations about the role of social media in shaping perceptions of family life. Shanann had shared many moments online, videos of her children playing, posts about her marriage, updates about her pregnancy. To viewers, these posts suggested happiness and stability. Yet, behind them, the fractures were widening. Some commentators suggested that social media can create pressure to maintain appearances, to project an image of perfection even when reality is more complicated. In Shanann's case, those images became both a testament to her devotion and a poignant reminder of what had been lost. In prison, Chris eventually spoke with investigators again, providing a fuller account of the events of August 13th. In those interviews, conducted after his sentencing, he abandoned the earlier narrative that Shanann had harmed the children. Instead, he admitted to the sequence of actions that investigators had already suspected. He described, in a quiet and detached manner, how he had taken the lives of his wife and daughters. For many, these confessions were deeply disturbing not only because of the details, but because of the absence of visible remorse. He spoke calmly, almost clinically, as if recounting events that had happened to someone else. These later interviews reinforced the perception of Chris as a man who compartmentalized his emotions, who struggled to connect his actions with their consequences. Psychologists suggested that this detachment was not unusual in individuals who commit crimes of this nature. By separating themselves from the emotional weight of their actions, they create a kind of distance that allows them to function, at least outwardly. But for those listening, the distance was chilling. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The public interest in the case did not fade quickly. Documentaries produced by major streaming platforms brought the story to new audiences, presenting it through the lens of police footage, social media posts, and interviews. Viewers across the world found themselves drawn into the quiet suburban neighborhood in Colorado, trying to understand how such devastation could emerge from a family that seemed so ordinary. In time, the community of Frederick began to heal, though scars remained. The Watts family home, once filled with the sounds of children, stood empty. Neighbors passed by with a sense of unease, the house becoming a symbol of tragedy. Eventually, discussions emerged about what should be done with the property, how the community could move forward while still remembering those who had been lost. For criminologists and investigators, the Watts case became a study in contradictions. It illustrated how outward appearances can conceal hidden realities, how seemingly minor behavioral shifts can point to deeper issues, and how the smallest details, a neighbor's camera, a friend's intuition, can prove crucial in uncovering the truth. It also raised questions about motive, about the psychology of someone who chooses annihilation over honesty, and about the fragile nature of identity when it is built on deception. Years later, the case still resonates. It remains a story not only of loss, but of the delicate balance between perception and reality, and of how even the most ordinary-seeming lives can carry hidden depths. In the years following the trial, the Watts case has remained in public consciousness, not only as a story of crime, but as a mirror reflecting larger questions about human behavior, family dynamics, and the fragility of trust. Unlike many criminal cases that fade from memory once the trial is over, this one has lingered. Its images, its recordings, and its contradictions continue to invite reflection. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. This chapter comes to a close with quiet questions that linger. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. For many, the story resonates because of its ordinariness. There were no dramatic warnings, no history of violent outbursts, no long pattern of criminal activity. Chris Watts was not the figure that one typically associates with such devastating crimes. He went to work each day. He participated in neighborhood gatherings. He smiled politely when spoken to. To his coworkers, he was reliable. To his neighbors, he was quiet. To Shanann's friends, he sometimes appeared distant, but never threatening. And yet, beneath that ordinary surface, an unthinkable decision was forming. This contrast between appearance and reality is what continues to draw attention. It raises questions about how well we know the people around us, and even how well we know ourselves. It suggests that ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary fractures, and that the signs of those fractures may not always be visible. Psychologists who have studied the case emphasize the role of pressure and identity. Chris was a man living two parallel lives. In one, he was a husband and father tied to responsibilities, financial challenges, and the everyday obligations of family life. In the other, he was a man newly energized by an affair, imagining a different future. The tension between these lives grew unbearable, and rather than confronting the reality, he sought escape. This pattern, while extreme in its outcome, reflects a broader truth. When people construct identities that cannot coexist, the collapse can be devastating. The case has also been revisited in classrooms and training programs for law enforcement. Investigators point to the small but telling details. The neighbor who noticed Chris's unusual behavior on the surveillance footage, the inconsistencies in his statements, the way his calm demeanor seemed incongruent with the circumstances. These details remind trainees of the importance of observation, of listening not only to what is said, but how it is said, and of trusting instincts when something feels wrong. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. For Shanann's family, the passage of time has brought neither resolution nor closure, but rather a quiet determination to keep her memory alive. They continue to share her story, to speak about her resilience, and to remind the world that she was more than the tragedy that befell her. They describe her laughter, her dedication to her children, and her hope for the future. In doing so, they seek to ensure that she, Bella, and Celeste are remembered not only for how they died, but for how they lived. The children, too, remain central in the memory of those who knew them. Bella, with her shy smile, and Celeste, with her energy and boldness, left impressions that have not faded. Their voices, captured in home videos, continue to circulate, reminders of innocence lost. For many who follow the case, those images of the children are the most difficult to reconcile with the events that unfolded. They embody what was at stake and what was taken away. As the years passed, the house on Saratoga Trail became a symbol of the tragedy. Neighbors avoided looking at it, yet could not forget its presence. It stood as a silent witness to what had happened, its rooms empty, its walls carrying memories that would not fade. Discussions emerged about whether the property should be sold, demolished, or preserved in some way. Each option carried its own weight, as if the physical space had absorbed the gravity of the events and could not easily be transformed into an ordinary home again. The enduring fascination with the case also reflects the era in which it occurred. The integration of social media into the narrative was unusual and striking. Shanann's frequent posts, videos, and updates provided a vivid, ongoing record of family life. Unlike many cases where the victims remain abstract, Shanann and her daughters were present in countless images and recordings. They could be seen laughing, playing, and living their daily lives. This archive of moments made their absence even more difficult to comprehend. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. In the quiet spaces of prison, Chris himself remains a figure of speculation. He has spoken in limited interviews, offering fragments of insight, but rarely providing the kind of answers that people seek. His tone, often flat and calm, gives little away. For some, this restraint feels unsettling, as though he has retreated into a place where remorse and reflection do not reach the surface. For others, it suggests a man who has always struggled to express emotion openly, now locked not only in a cell, but within his own silence. The psychology of his actions has been debated endlessly. Was it a sudden decision, born of panic and fear of discovery? Was it the result of long-building resentment, an attempt to erase one life in order to create another? Or was it something more complex, a collision of personality traits, pressures, and desires that cannot be reduced to a single explanation? Each theory offers pieces of understanding, but none can fully account for the choice he made. Over time, the case has become part of a broader discussion about family annihilation, a rare but devastating form of crime in which one family member destroys the others. Experts note that such cases often involve a sense of entrapment, financial strain, or the pursuit of a new relationship. They emphasize that while these crimes shock communities, they are not entirely without precedent. By studying them, investigators hope to better recognize warning signs and prevent future tragedies. Yet, for all the analysis, what remains most powerful are the personal stories, the memories of Shannon's friends, the recollections of her family, the images of her daughters. These are what give the case its enduring resonance. They remind us that behind the headlines and the court documents, there were real lives, full of hope and possibility. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. As documentaries continue to revisit the story, as articles are written and discussions continue online, the Watts case takes on the quality of a modern cautionary tale. It warns of the dangers of secrecy, of the fragility of relationships built on deception, and of the consequences of failing to confront problems directly. But it also serves as a reminder of resilience, of how families and communities, even when shattered, continue to hold on to memory, to love, and to the determination that such lives will not be forgotten. In the end, the story settles into a quiet place. The legal process has long since concluded. The confessions have been given, the facts are known. What remains is the silence left in their absence, the empty house, the still photographs, the videos that play back voices from a time before. For those who listen, who reflect, or who drift off to sleep with the story in their minds, it lingers softly, a reminder of lives once full of light. In the mid-1970s, communities across California were filled with a sense of possibility. The suburbs were growing, the state was thriving, and families built their lives in neighborhoods that felt safe and predictable. Yet beneath that surface, an unknown figure began moving silently through those same neighborhoods. For decades, he would remain a mystery, known only by the names investigators gave him. First, the East Area rapist, then the original Night Stalker, and finally, when the full scope of his crimes became clear, the Golden State Killer. The story of this case is not only about the acts themselves, but about the painstaking investigation that unfolded over more than 40 years. It is a story of law enforcement officers who refused to give up, of forensic scientists who worked at the edges of evolving technology, and of countless false leads that carried hope only to end in disappointment. It is, above all, a story of persistence, of a search that lasted across generations, moving slowly but steadily toward a conclusion that once seemed impossible. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The investigation began in Sacramento County in 1976. A series of home invasions had begun to occur in quiet residential areas. The crimes shared certain details that caught the attention of detectives. The suspect seemed to study his victims in advance, watching houses carefully, learning patterns, and selecting times when he could move undetected. He left behind evidence of meticulous planning, windows forced open with care, ligatures prepared ahead of time, and routes chosen to avoid detection. Though his acts were violent, investigators noted something that stood out even more: the degree of organization. This was not a man acting impulsively. He was methodical, deliberate, and careful to cover his tracks. As reports mounted, the community grew anxious. Neighborhood watch groups formed, locks were replaced, and families began taking precautions they had never considered before. Police patrols increased, but the suspect seemed to remain a step ahead. At crime scenes, investigators searched for clues, fingerprints, footprints, fibers, but each lead seemed to vanish. The footprints suggested a man of average build, perhaps athletic, but beyond that, the evidence was frustratingly thin. Through the late 1970s, detectives worked long hours, building files, mapping incidents, and attempting to predict patterns. They compared notes across jurisdictions since the crimes stretched beyond one area. Sacramento investigators spoke with colleagues in nearby counties, realizing that the suspect did not recognize geographic boundaries. He moved, striking in different cities, then disappearing for weeks at a time. This mobility made it difficult to anticipate his actions and nearly impossible to concentrate resources in one place for long. As the years passed, the investigation expanded. By the early 1980s, another set of crimes began to surface in Southern California, attacks that shared similarities with the earlier cases in the Sacramento region. Detectives in Contra Costa County, Ventura, and Orange County began to notice parallels. The use of pre-cut ligatures, the careful planning, the way the offender seemed to know intimate details of his victims' lives. Slowly, investigators came to believe that these cases, though separated by hundreds of miles, were connected. But in that era, communication between counties was often fragmented. Databases were limited, and coordination relied on phone calls, meetings, and the willingness of detectives to compare notes informally. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. This lack of centralized information made progress difficult. Each jurisdiction worked hard, but the suspect slipped away, his identity shielded by time and distance. The investigation became a patchwork of efforts, with some detectives convinced they were pursuing the same man, while others remained cautious, unwilling to link cases without definitive proof. Meanwhile, forensic science was beginning to change. In the early 1980s, DNA analysis was not yet available as an investigative tool. Evidence such as blood, hair, or other biological samples could be collected, but the technology to fully analyze and compare them across cases had not yet been developed. Investigators preserved what they could, carefully storing samples in the hope that future science might provide answers. This patience would prove critical decades later. Throughout the 1980s, as investigators chased leads, the suspect seemed to vanish for periods of time. He would reappear, leaving behind new cases, then disappear again. Each return reignited the investigation, but each pause created fresh uncertainty. Detectives wondered if he had been arrested under another name, if he had moved to a new state, or if he had simply stopped. Without new crimes, the trail often went cold, leaving investigators with files stacked high, but no suspect to bring into custody. The psychological profile of the offender became another tool for detectives. Behavioral experts studied the cases, attempting to understand his patterns and mindset. They described him as organized, controlling, and careful. He seemed to crave dominance and precision, yet he was also adaptable, capable of adjusting his methods as needed. The profile suggested a man who might appear ordinary in daily life, blending into his community while hiding a darker secret. Investigators followed hundreds of leads. They looked into men who lived near crime scenes, men who matched descriptions, men who had been arrested for similar offenses. Each time they hoped they had found the right person. Each time testing or further investigation ruled the suspect out. The disappointment was heavy, but the work continued. Detectives often described the case as one that never left their minds, one they carried with them even when working on other assignments. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. By the 1990s, DNA technology had advanced significantly. Samples collected from crime scenes years earlier were tested, and the results confirmed what some investigators had long suspected. The East Area rapist in Sacramento and the original Night Stalker in Southern California were the same man. This was a breakthrough, collapsing separate mysteries into one. The offender was now recognized as a single individual responsible for crimes across a vast span of California. He was given a new name, the Golden State Killer, a term that captured both the scope of his offenses and the breadth of the investigation. Yet even with this confirmation, his identity remained hidden. DNA showed that the cases were connected, but it did not reveal who he was. Detectives built genealogical charts, looked at prison databases, and searched military records. They considered that he might have had training in law enforcement or the military, given his apparent knowledge of investigative techniques and his ability to evade capture. They studied his movements, trying to match them to possible suspects who had relocated during the same years. False leads abounded. At times, investigators were certain they were close. They surveilled men who seemed to fit the profile, collecting discarded items to test against DNA. Each negative result was frustrating, but it reinforced the need for caution and accuracy. No detective wanted to risk accusing the wrong man. As the years stretched into decades, the case took on a legendary quality within law enforcement. New generations of detectives inherited the files, adding their own notes and perspectives. Retired officers, who had spent years on the case, remained invested, hoping to hear one day that the mystery had been solved. The community, too, remembered. For many who had lived through the years when fear was high, the case remained a lingering shadow, a reminder of vulnerability even in seemingly safe neighborhoods. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. By the early 2000s, forensic genealogy had begun to emerge as a powerful tool. Investigators realized that by comparing crime scene DNA to public genetic databases, they could identify distant relatives of suspects, constructing family trees that might eventually lead to the offender himself. This technique was still new, and its application to such a cold case was ambitious. Yet for the Golden State Killer investigation, it offered hope after decades of frustration. By the mid-2000s, the Golden State Killer case had become both a challenge and a burden for law enforcement across California. Generations of detectives had worked the files, and while the DNA connections had unified the crimes under one offender, his name remained elusive. The mystery grew deeper with each passing year, but so did the determination of those who carried the case forward. The advent of forensic genealogy offered a new direction. Traditional DNA databases, like those maintained by law enforcement, required a direct match to a known offender. The Golden State Killer had never been arrested for crimes that required a DNA sample, and so his profile sat in databases without a corresponding name. Genealogical databases, however, were different. They contained DNA submitted by members of the public, often for ancestry research, and they provided not direct matches but partial connections. Cousins, distant relatives, individuals who shared fragments of genetic code. Investigators realized that if they could find even a distant relative of the suspect, they could build a family tree backward and forward, using historical records, census data, and birth certificates to narrow the possibilities until they reached the right individual. It was a labor-intensive process, but for detectives who had pursued dead ends for decades, the effort was worth it. In 2018, investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile, derived from crime scene evidence, to an open-source genealogical database. The results came back with distant relatives. They were not close enough to point directly to the suspect, but they were enough to begin building the branches of a family tree. Slowly, with painstaking care, genealogists traced the lines of descent, moving from the late 19th century to the present. They mapped connections between cousins, uncles, aunts, and siblings. Each name was checked, each potential link documented. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. As the family tree grew, investigators began to see patterns. The suspect had to be male, of the right age, living in California during the 1970s and 1980s. These filters narrowed the list. Eventually, the branches of the tree led toward one family in particular. From there, the circle closed in on a single man, Joseph James DeAngelo. When DeAngelo's name surfaced, detectives were struck by how unremarkable it seemed. He was living quietly in a suburban neighborhood near Sacramento. He had once worked as a police officer in the 1970s, a detail that immediately caught attention. His training could explain his ability to avoid detection, his apparent knowledge of investigative techniques, and his comfort with surveillance and control. After leaving law enforcement, he had gone on to work as a mechanic, living an ordinary life, raising children, and blending into his community. For decades, he had been the neighbor who attracted little notice. Surveillance on DeAngelo began quietly. Investigators collected items he discarded, tissues, objects touched and thrown away. These samples were sent to the lab, compared against the preserved crime scene DNA. The results were definitive. Joseph James DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. The arrest in April 2018 brought an end to one of the longest and most frustrating manhunts in American criminal history. Detectives who had worked the case for years gathered to watch the moment unfold. DeAngelo, then 72 years old, was taken into custody outside his home. Neighbors were stunned. To them, he was simply an older man who lived a quiet life. They had no idea that he had carried such a hidden past. The reaction across California and across the country was immediate. For survivors and families of victims, the arrest was a moment of both relief and sorrow. Relief that the man responsible had finally been identified, sorrow that the answers had taken so long to arrive. Some had spent decades waiting for this moment. Others had passed away before they could see it. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Inside interrogation rooms, DeAngelo spoke little. He mumbled about an inner voice that had driven him, though whether this was genuine or a late attempt to explain his actions remained unclear. For investigators, his silence was less important than the fact that his identity was finally known. His ability to hide finally ended. The breakthrough represented not only the resolution of a single case, but also a turning point in forensic science. The use of genealogical DNA had opened a new frontier, showing how cold cases once thought unsolvable could be revived. In the months that followed, other cases across the country were reopened with this method, leading to arrests and resolutions that had long seemed out of reach. For those who had worked the Golden State Killer case from the beginning, the moment was bittersweet. Detectives who had spent their careers searching described the arrest as both triumphant and sobering. They had finally answered the question of who, but the knowledge could not undo the harm done. Still, they had kept their promise to never stop searching, to hold on to the evidence until technology caught up, and to bring the truth into the light. The arrest also revealed the extent of the secrecy DeAngelo had maintained. His family members were shocked. They had known him as a father, a relative, an ordinary man. None had suspected the double life he had lived decades earlier. His neighbors, too, expressed disbelief. They had seen him ride his motorcycle, shop for groceries, and tend to his yard. Nothing in his daily behavior hinted at the crimes that had defined a generation of fear in California. As DeAngelo entered the legal system, the scale of his offenses was laid out in court. Survivors told their stories, some for the first time in decades. Prosecutors presented the evidence, not only to secure a conviction, but to create a record, a comprehensive account of what he had done. DeAngelo himself sat quietly, often motionless, his face giving little away. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Forensic experts emphasized how close the case had come to remaining unsolved forever. Had evidence not been carefully preserved in the 1970s and 1980s, had samples been lost or destroyed, the connection to DeAngelo might never have been made. The patience of early investigators, who stored materials with faith in future science, proved decisive. Their efforts, combined with the innovation of genealogical methods, brought resolution at last. Even with the arrest, the story of the Golden State Killer remained as much about the investigation as about the man himself. It was about the years of persistence, the detectives who carried the case forward when hope seemed thin, and the way technology transformed what had once been impossible into reality. After Joseph James DeAngelo's arrest in April 2018, the focus shifted from the investigation to the legal proceedings. For many, the arrest had been the long-awaited conclusion, but in truth, it was only the beginning of a new chapter. The question now was how the justice system would address decades of crimes that spanned jurisdictions, counties, and entire regions of California. From the start, prosecutors faced a challenge. Many of DeAngelo's earliest offenses, particularly those from the 1970s, were past the statute of limitations. This meant that while survivors and investigators could speak about them, they could not all be prosecuted in court. Still, prosecutors from multiple counties coordinated closely, determined to present a comprehensive case that reflected the full scope of his actions. DeAngelo was charged with multiple counts of the killing and kidnapping, crimes for which there was no statute of limitations. The charges spanned Ventura, Orange, Sacramento, and other counties. The courtroom became a gathering place not only for lawyers and detectives, but also for survivors, families of victims, and members of the public who had followed the case for decades. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The image of DeAngelo during these proceedings was striking. Once a police officer, then a man who had lived quietly in the suburbs, he now appeared frail, seated in a wheelchair, his voice thin. Some questioned whether this was genuine or whether he was presenting himself in a weaker state to evoke sympathy. For survivors, it was a stark contrast to the figure who had once terrorized their lives. In June 2020, DeAngelo entered a legal plea agreement. He admitted guilt to 13 counts of the killing and 13 counts of kidnapping, as well as numerous other crimes that had been attributed to him but could not be formally prosecuted due to the passage of time. The legal plea deal spared him the death penalty, instead guaranteeing multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. For survivors and families, the agreement meant avoiding a lengthy trial, one that would have forced them to relive painful details again and again. It offered finality, if not closure. During the hearing, survivors and family members of victims were given the chance to speak. Their statements were powerful, often quiet, and deeply moving. Some described the fear that had lived with them for decades, the way they checked doors and windows every night, the way the events had shaped their lives in ways they could never escape. Others spoke of loved ones lost, memories cut short, and the absence that had remained. DeAngelo, for the most part, sat in silence. He offered no explanations, no reflections. When he did speak, his words were brief. At one point, as the hearing concluded, he whispered, "I admit," and then, "I'm truly sorry." Whether these words carried genuine remorse or were a final formality was left for others to interpret. The sentencing brought an official end to the case, but it did not erase the decades of fear and uncertainty that had preceded it. For survivors, there was some relief in knowing that the man responsible had finally been named and held accountable. Yet for many, the experience could never be undone. The memories remained vivid, the impact lasting. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Beyond the courtroom, the arrest and sentencing of DeAngelo sparked a wide range of reactions. Communities across California revisited the years of fear, reflecting on how the case had shaped their sense of safety. Retired detectives spoke about the long nights, the endless files, the false leads, and the weight of carrying unsolved crimes. Criminologists and psychologists examined the case as an example of how someone could live a double life, presenting as ordinary while concealing extraordinary violence. The role of forensic genealogy also became a central subject of discussion. DeAngelo's identification marked one of the first high-profile cases solved through this method, and its success prompted law enforcement agencies across the country to apply the technique to their own cold cases. Within months, other long unsolved crimes were being revisited, and arrests were made using the same approach. The Golden State Killer case became not only a resolution for one investigation, but a model for the future of forensic science. Ethical debates followed as well. Some raised concerns about the use of genealogical databases, arguing that individuals who submitted their DNA for personal reasons might not have anticipated law enforcement using it in this way. Others countered that the benefits, resolving violent crimes, providing answers to families, far outweighed the concerns. The case became a catalyst for discussions about privacy, technology, and the evolving relationship between science and justice. For those who had lived through the years of the Golden State Killer's activity, the arrest was both surreal and grounding. It was difficult to reconcile the frail man in the courtroom with the figure who had once seemed unstoppable, who had moved silently through neighborhoods and eluded capture for decades. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The DNA was precise, the genealogical connections unbroken. After so many years of uncertainty, the truth was clear. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Journalists and documentary filmmakers chronicled the process, producing books, films, and series that revisited the long investigation. They interviewed detectives, survivors, and experts, weaving together the story of persistence and science that had finally led to resolution. The case entered the public consciousness not only as a true crime story, but as an illustration of the power of determination and the reach of modern forensic tools. In the years after his conviction, DeAngelo has lived in prison, serving his life sentences. He remains largely silent, speaking little and offering no further insight into his motives. For many, the lack of explanation is one of the most difficult aspects of the case. Why he acted as he did, how he justified his actions to himself, what drove him to maintain his double life. These questions may never be answered. The silence is itself a kind of reminder that even with technology and persistence, not all mysteries can be fully resolved. Still, the investigation stands as a testament to patience. Decades of careful evidence collection, meticulous preservation, and relentless pursuit made the final resolution possible. Without those efforts, the Golden State Killer might never have been identified. For law enforcement, the case is a lesson in endurance. For survivors, it is proof that even the longest silence can eventually be broken. The legacy of the Golden State Killer case stretches far beyond the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo. For law enforcement, survivors, and the public, it became a story not only of fear and loss, but also of perseverance and scientific innovation. Decades after the crimes first began, the way the case concluded altered the landscape of criminal investigations. One of the most profound impacts was the acceptance of forensic genealogy as a legitimate and powerful tool. Before DeAngelo's arrest, the method was known to genealogists and hobbyists, but had not been widely applied in criminal justice. His case demonstrated how a tiny fragment of preserved DNA, combined with genealogical databases, could unlock the identity of a suspect who had eluded capture for decades. Soon after, agencies across the country began revisiting old files, applying the same approach to cases once thought unsolvable. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Within a short span, numerous cold cases were resolved. Families who had waited for answers for years, sometimes generations, suddenly found resolution. Names were attached to crimes that had long been faceless, and victims were given recognition. The momentum from the Golden State Killer case created a ripple effect, and with each new resolution, the legitimacy of forensic genealogy grew stronger. But the new tool also brought new questions. Privacy advocates raised concerns about how genetic information was being used, and whether individuals who shared their DNA for personal reasons fully understood the implications. Some companies changed their terms of service, clarifying whether and how law enforcement could access their data. Legislators began to discuss possible guidelines, balancing the potential to solve violent crimes with the need to protect individual privacy. The debate continues, a reminder that technology often moves faster than policy. For survivors and their families, the resolution brought varying emotions. Some expressed gratitude that after decades of silence, the truth had been spoken and the man responsible had been named. Others found the process reopening wounds they had spent years trying to close. The resolution did not erase the past, nor did it fully heal the scars, but it provided an anchor in a story that had for so long been uncertain. The public response was equally layered. The story of the Golden State Killer became part of the broader cultural fascination with true crime, inspiring documentaries, books, and podcasts. Yet it also carried a cautionary dimension. It illustrated not only the persistence of law enforcement, but also the vulnerability of communities, the way fear could shape everyday life for years, and the long shadows cast by unsolved crimes. Retired detectives often reflected on the case in interviews, describing the toll it had taken on them personally and professionally. Many had spent their careers pursuing leads that went nowhere, yet they continued to file reports, preserve evidence, and wait for new techniques. Their dedication, often unseen and unacknowledged, became an essential part of why the case was eventually solved. For younger detectives and forensic scientists, The case became a symbol of why persistence mattered, even when progress seemed impossible. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Psychologists studying the case noted the unique challenge survivors faced. Living with an unsolved crime for decades created a particular kind of trauma, an ongoing uncertainty that never allowed for closure. The arrest of DeAngelo provided answers, but it also forced survivors to revisit experiences they had long tried to set aside. Some found a measure of peace in seeing justice done. Others found themselves reminded of fear they had never truly escaped. The case underscored how long the effects of crime can endure, extending far beyond the immediate event. For communities across California, the story became a point of reflection. Neighborhoods that had once lived under fear recalled those years, speaking about how families had changed their routines, how people had moved away, how ordinary life had been shaped by the threat of an unknown figure. In the quiet streets of suburban towns, the memory of checking locks, drawing curtains, and listening for unfamiliar sounds remained vivid even after decades had passed. The figure of Joseph James DeAngelo, once concealed, now stood revealed. His double life, police officer, husband, father, and neighbor, was difficult for many to reconcile with the crimes he committed. The contrast between the ordinary appearance and the extraordinary violence became a central theme in how people remembered the case. Yet over time, attention shifted away from DeAngelo himself and toward the broader lessons of the investigation. As years passed after the sentencing, DeAngelo remained in prison, largely silent. News of him faded, but the legacy of the case continued. Law enforcement agencies cited the investigation in training, forensic genealogy expanded, and survivors' stories continued to be told in classrooms, conferences, and public forums. The case was no longer just about a man and his crimes. It was about how persistence, science, and determination could change the course of justice. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. When people speak of the Golden State Killer today, it is often in the context of resilience. Survivors who shared their stories publicly became voices not only for themselves, but for others whose cases remain unsolved. Detectives who had long since retired lived to see the resolution, a validation of their efforts, and a reassurance that their work had mattered. Forensic scientists spoke of the case as a turning point, one that transformed their field and reshaped what seemed possible. And in the quiet spaces where families still remember and communities still reflect, the story remains. It lingers not in dramatic headlines or sensational detail, but in the steady recognition that even after decades of uncertainty, answers can come. The long silence does not erase the pursuit of truth, and the truth, when finally spoken, carries its own kind of weight. Let the moment rest, small truths linger in the hush. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston is today most widely known not only for its remarkable collection of art, but also for the mystery that has haunted it for decades, the theft that occurred on the night of March 18, 1990. To understand the scope and nature of the case, it is helpful to begin with the institution itself, its origins, and the legacy of its founder. This background illuminates why the crime was so unusual, why it struck such a deep chord in the art world, and why, more than 30 years later, the puzzle remains unresolved. Isabella Stewart Gardner was a woman of striking character in the late 19th and early 20th century. Born into wealth in 1840, she married John Lowell Gardner Jr., and together they traveled extensively, cultivating friendships among artists, musicians, and intellectuals. Their shared love of art and culture led to the idea of creating a museum in Boston that would house their collection and inspire the public. Isabella herself was the driving force behind the project. She acquired land in the Fenway neighborhood, and in 1903 the museum opened its doors. It was designed not only as a gallery, but as a kind of Venetian palace, transplanted to New England, with its central courtyard, cloisters, and atmospheric rooms arranged according to her personal vision. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The museum contained masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Titian, Degas, and many others, alongside tapestries, manuscripts, and decorative arts from across the globe. Gardner's will specified that the collection should remain exactly as she had arranged it, with nothing moved, nothing added, and nothing sold. This stipulation has remained in effect to this day, which means that the theft of 1990 left gaps, empty frames and bare spaces, still visible to visitors. These voids are as eloquent as the works that remain, and they serve as reminders of what was taken. On the night in question, two men disguised as police officers arrived at the museum around 1:24 a.m. It was St. Patrick's Day, and Boston was lively with celebrations. The thieves' timing was clever. The streets were full of revelers, and the sound of sirens or unusual movements in the city might easily go unnoticed amid the festivities. The two guards on duty, Richard Abath and Randy Heston, were relatively inexperienced. Abath, a young man with an interest in music, had worked at the museum for some time, though he was not known as the most disciplined employee. Heston was newer, working an overnight shift that was quiet and uneventful until the arrival of the supposed officers. The thieves rang the buzzer at the side door and claimed they were responding to a disturbance. Museum policy did not require guards to admit police officers without verification, but Abath decided to let them in. Once inside, the impostors told him there was a warrant for his arrest and asked him to step away from the desk. He complied. They handcuffed him and soon did the same to Heston. The guards were then taken to the basement, their hands and feet secured with duct tape and left in a vulnerable position. The thieves then proceeded to move through the museum with an unusual mixture of confidence and carelessness. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The entire operation lasted 81 minutes, an extraordinary length of time for such a crime. In most art thefts, speed is of the essence, yet here the intruders lingered, choosing works and even attempting to remove items unsuccessfully. They stole 13 pieces in total, including Vermeer's The Concert, one of only about 3 dozen paintings by the Dutch master known to exist. They took Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee, his only known seascape, and a smaller Rembrandt self-portrait etching. They removed Degas sketches, a finial from a Napoleonic flag, and a Chinese bronze beaker known as a gu. Curiously, they ignored some of the most valuable objects in the museum, including Titian's The Rape of Europa, which remained untouched. Their choices puzzled investigators from the very beginning. The way the works were handled also revealed contradictions. Some canvases were cut directly from their frames, a brutal and damaging method not characteristic of professional art thieves, who usually prefer to remove works intact. Yet at the same time, the thieves seemed to know something about the security system. They went directly to certain galleries, and their movements suggested prior familiarity with the layout. The question of whether they had inside knowledge, or perhaps guidance from someone connected to the museum, has lingered ever since. When the day staff arrived in the morning, they discovered the guards missing and the alarm system behaving strangely. Eventually, Abath and Heston were found in the basement, still bound. By then, of course, the thieves had long since vanished. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was called in, and the search for the missing art began. The initial hope was that the theft was the work of opportunists who might attempt to ransom the paintings back to the museum or to collectors. Yet days turned into weeks, and no such communication arrived. The stolen works seemed to disappear into a void. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. From a financial perspective, the crime was staggering. Estimates of the value of the stolen art have varied, but even conservative figures place it in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The concert alone, if ever to reappear on the market, could command over $200 million. Yet in reality, such works cannot be sold publicly. Their fame makes them unsellable in legitimate channels, and even in illicit markets they carry enormous risks. Thus the logical question emerged: what was the purpose of the theft, and where could the art have gone? Investigators pursued multiple theories. One possibility was that the works were stolen on commission, intended for a private collector willing to hide them indefinitely. This idea has fueled novels and films, but in practice it is rare. Most wealthy collectors have little interest in acquiring works they can never display or insure. Another theory was that the art was stolen to be used as collateral in criminal transactions, objects of such high value that they could serve as bargaining chips in drug deals, arms trades, or negotiations with law enforcement. There is precedent for such use. Stolen art has occasionally resurfaced when criminals attempted to use it to mitigate sentences or settle debts. The FBI focused early attention on Boston's organized crime networks. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, figures such as James Whitey Bulger and the Patriarca crime family were prominent in the region. Rumors circulated that the Gardner theft could be linked to these groups, either as a demonstration of power or as a financial venture. Informants provided leads, but none yielded the paintings. Over time, some names became central in the narrative. Robert Gentile, a Connecticut mobster, was repeatedly connected to the missing works, though he denied knowledge and no art was ever recovered from his possession. Other suspects included individuals already imprisoned for unrelated crimes, some of whom hinted they had information, perhaps to gain leverage, but no solid evidence was produced. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The museum itself became part of the story, not just as the victim of the theft, but as a kind of shrine to the mystery. Visitors saw the empty frames, preserved in place in accordance with Isabella Gardner's will, and were reminded daily of what was gone. This decision to leave the gaps visible transformed the museum into both an art institution and a crime scene, an ongoing memorial to the event. The juxtaposition of the serene Venetian-style courtyard and the knowledge of the violence done to the collection created a peculiar atmosphere, one that drew as much fascination as the art that remained. In the years that followed, the Gardner heist became one of the most famous unsolved crimes in the world. Books, documentaries, and countless articles explored its details, each proposing new theories. The lack of resolution has made it a fertile ground for speculation. Unlike crimes that are solved and concluded, this one remains alive, with each anniversary reviving attention. The FBI has stated that they believe they know who carried out the theft, but they have not disclosed names, and no arrests have been made in connection with the crime. The official position is that the case remains open and active. An intriguing aspect of the Gardner case is the role of time. As decades have passed, suspects and witnesses have aged or died. Memories fade, evidence deteriorates, and the possibility of definitive resolution seems to recede. Yet at the same time, the stolen art remains what it is, priceless, irreplaceable, and instantly recognizable. Unlike cash or jewels, which can be spent or recut, these paintings cannot be altered without destroying their value. They must exist somewhere, in some form. The mystery is therefore one not only of who committed the crime, but of where the art can be hidden for so long. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The museum and the FBI have repeatedly offered rewards for information leading to the recovery of the works. At times, the reward has risen as high as $10 million, the largest ever offered by a private institution for stolen art. Appeals have been made in newspapers, on television, and through international law enforcement channels. Yet the silence has been nearly total. The paintings have never been definitively cited. No credible photographs have surfaced, and no ransom demands have materialized. The void has persisted, as if the works vanished into another dimension. For many observers, the Gardner heist is not merely a crime story, but a kind of cultural riddle. It poses questions about the value of art, the vulnerabilities of institutions, and the strange interactions between culture and crime. It also highlights the human element, the decisions of a guard to open a door, the choices of thieves in selecting objects, the silence of communities that may know more than they admit. Each small detail takes on weight in the absence of resolution, and the narrative becomes layered with interpretation. The first months after the theft were filled with intense activity. The FBI followed leads not only in Boston but abroad, in Ireland, in Europe, and in the Middle East, where rumors suggested the art might have been trafficked. None of these avenues bore fruit. Agents cultivated informants within the underworld, offered immunity deals, and even tested theories about international smuggling routes. Yet the works did not reappear. We leave that story now, carrying only what remains, small, soft questions. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. In the immediate aftermath of the theft, investigators confronted a paradox. On the one hand, the museum's security system had recorded certain movements. Sensors showed where the thieves had passed, and the timeline could be reconstructed with some precision. On the other hand, the crime had left almost no usable forensic evidence. There were no fingerprints that could be matched, no DNA traces that yielded results, and no witnesses other than the two guards who were themselves incapacitated early in the incident. This combination, detailed information about what happened, paired with an absence of evidence pointing to who did it, set the tone for the decades of inquiry that followed. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The FBI quickly took the lead, working with Boston police and with experts in art theft. The Bureau has a special art crime team, though at the time it was far less developed than it is today. The scale of the Gardner case, however, underscored the need for specialized attention. In those first weeks, agents interviewed museum staff, former employees, art dealers, and individuals with criminal records known for burglary. Every tip was considered, from credible accounts to outlandish suggestions. The museum itself, meanwhile, became a hub of speculation as journalists and the public pressed for answers. The first natural avenue was to look at the guards. Richard Abath, the one who opened the door to the supposed officers, came under scrutiny. He admitted that he had violated protocol in letting them in without verification. Moreover, it was revealed that earlier in his shift, he had triggered an alarm by opening a side door, then returned inside. Investigators wondered whether this had been a signal to someone outside, a test of the alarm system, or simply a careless act. Abath denied involvement and maintained that he had been duped like anyone else. No direct evidence tied him to the crime, yet suspicion lingered, especially since the thieves had managed to go directly to certain works without wasting time. Was it possible that someone inside had provided them with guidance? At the same time, law enforcement explored connections to organized crime in Boston. The early 1990s were a period of flux in the city's underworld. The Irish mob, led by figures like Whitey Bulger, was notorious not only for violence but also for manipulation of law enforcement through informant relationships. The Italian-American Patriarca crime family also had deep roots in the region. The Gardner theft did not fit neatly into either group's usual activities, yet the magnitude of the crime suggested involvement of experienced criminals rather than amateurs. The idea emerged that the art might have been stolen not to be sold on the black market, but to be held as a form of currency in criminal dealings. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. This theory gained traction because, in the underworld, possession of high-value stolen goods can function as a bargaining chip. If a mobster faces long prison time, offering to return priceless art in exchange for leniency could be a tempting strategy. Indeed, the FBI has recorded instances where stolen art surfaced decades later, presented by criminals seeking reduced sentences. The Gardner paintings, with their astronomical value and global fame, would be the ultimate bargaining tool. The question was whether anyone in Boston's underworld had actually acquired them. Over the years, multiple names surfaced. Among the most frequently mentioned was Robert "Bobby" Donati, a known associate of organized crime who had their lives taken in 1991, barely a year after the theft. Some informants suggested Donati had been involved in the Gardner job, perhaps intending to use the art in negotiations with the Patriarca family. His death left questions unanswered. Another figure was Bobby Guarente, also linked to organized crime, who reportedly had access to some of the stolen works before his death in 2004. Statements from those close to him fueled speculation, though again, no paintings were produced. Perhaps the most enduringly connected name was Robert Gentile, a Connecticut mobster arrested multiple times in later years. Federal authorities repeatedly searched his property, convinced he either possessed or knew the whereabouts of Gardner pieces. They even found lists and notes referencing the stolen art, suggesting knowledge at the very least. Gentile consistently denied involvement, and no works were found, despite searches of his home, vehicles, and storage spaces. Until his death in 2021, he maintained that he knew nothing. Whether he truly did, or whether the art had slipped through his hands, remains unresolved. Outside Boston, attention turned abroad. Rumors circulated that the paintings had been moved to Europe, possibly through Irish channels connected to the IRA. The theory held that the works could have been shipped overseas as collateral in arms deals. Investigators pursued leads in Ireland, in the Netherlands, even in Japan, but none yielded the art. A recurring pattern emerged. Someone in custody or under investigation would hint at having knowledge of the Gardner works, often in vague terms, and the FBI would devote resources to verifying the claim. In each case, the trail ended in disappointment. Sometimes it seemed the mere mention of the Gardner paintings was itself a form of currency, a way for criminals to gain attention or concessions even if they had no real access to the works. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Meanwhile, the museum continued to live with its absence. The empty frames in the Dutch room, in particular, became iconic. The large void left by Rembrandt's storm-tossed seascape, the smaller gap for Vermeer's The Concert. Visitors confronted not only the loss, but the physical reminder of theft itself. Critics debated whether Isabella Stewart Gardner's stipulation that nothing be altered was ultimately wise or limiting. Some argued that by preserving the voids, the museum kept the wound fresh, a constant advertisement of what had been stolen. Others felt it was fitting, a way of honoring Gardner's will and keeping the search alive. The FBI, for its part, occasionally made public statements suggesting optimism. On anniversaries, officials would assert that they believed they knew the identities of the thieves, though they did not disclose names. In 2013, they stated explicitly that the two men involved were members of a criminal organization based in New England, and that the works had been moved through Connecticut and Philadelphia in the years following the theft. They suggested that by the early 2000s, the trail had gone cold. Yet even this limited disclosure raised more questions than answers. Why not name the suspects if they were already dead or imprisoned for other crimes? Why withhold so much when public involvement might help? The Bureau maintained that secrecy was necessary to protect ongoing leads. Over time, the Gardner case took on the quality of a legend, with new theories emerging almost annually. Some pointed to the possibility of an inside job, though no employee was ever charged. Others speculated that the thieves had panicked, failing to secure a buyer, and had hidden or even destroyed the works to avoid being caught. The latter idea, while horrifying, cannot be entirely dismissed. Art has been lost forever in less dramatic ways, whether through neglect, fire, or deliberate destruction. Yet most experts believe the Gardner paintings still exist, preserved somewhere in secret, their value too great for criminals to discard. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. It is worth pausing here to consider the individual works and why their absence is so painful. Vermeer's The Concert was among the most treasured. Vermeer left behind a tiny body of work, about 34 paintings, each meticulously studied for centuries. The concert depicted three figures engaged in music making, a quiet domestic scene imbued with light and harmony. Its theft removed not just a painting, but a vital piece of cultural history. Similarly, Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee carried unique importance as his only seascape, a dynamic and turbulent image contrasting with his more typical portraits and religious scenes. Its loss represents a permanent wound in the study of Rembrandt's evolution. Even the smaller objects carried weight. The Chinese gu, a bronze vessel more than 3 millennia old, connected the museum's European collection to a broader global heritage. The Degas sketches captured fleeting moments of movement, characteristic of his fascination with ballet and everyday life. The Napoleonic finial, seemingly modest compared to the paintings, nonetheless carried symbolic resonance as a link to history and power. Together, the 13 stolen items represented a diverse cross-section of human creativity, spanning continents and centuries. Their absence is not merely financial, but cultural, a subtraction from the shared heritage of all who value art. As years passed, the case acquired layers of myth. Journalists published long features, some focusing on the suspects, others on the art world's longing for the lost masterpieces. Documentaries revisited the timeline, adding interviews with investigators and art experts. Books appeared, offering competing theories, each confident in its conclusion, yet none able to deliver the missing works. The narrative became a kind of mirror, reflecting the obsessions of those who studied it. Some emphasized the failings of museum security and guard training. Others highlighted the complexities of organized crime and the way cultural property could be entangled with illicit economies. Still, others focused on the psychological dimension. Why people steal art they cannot sell. Why they hoard. Why they hide. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. In 1997, the museum and the FBI jointly offered a reward of $1 million for information leading to the recovery of the art. This sum was later increased to $5 million, and eventually to $10 million, the largest reward ever offered for stolen art. Such an incentive might have been expected to draw out someone with knowledge. Yet the silence endured. From time to time, individuals came forward claiming to know the whereabouts of the paintings, but verification always collapsed. The works remained hidden, tantalizingly out of reach. One factor complicating the investigation was the code of silence within organized crime circles. In Boston, loyalty and fear played powerful roles. Informants were rare, and even those who spoke often withheld crucial details. Some speculated that the paintings were indeed stored in the city for years, perhaps in basements, warehouses, or safe houses, before being moved elsewhere. There were even rumors of the art being damaged or destroyed accidentally while in hiding. Yet none of these accounts produced tangible evidence. By the early 2000s, the FBI's official line was that they knew the identities of the thieves, but lacked sufficient evidence to prosecute. This position both reassured and frustrated the public. If the Bureau truly knew who had done it, why not confirm? If they lacked evidence, how could they be so certain? The opacity of the statements contributed to the aura of mystery, making the Gardner theft not just an unsolved crime, but an ongoing enigma. Among the most persistent avenues of inquiry into the Gardner Museum theft have been the personalities who occupied Boston's underworld during the late 1980s and early 1990s. These figures were part of a network that blurred the line between organized crime families, small-scale hustlers, and international connections. Each name that emerged seemed plausible at first, yet time and again, the promise of resolution dissolved into ambiguity. The case thus became not just a hunt for stolen art, but an exploration of the social fabric of crime in New England. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. One of the earliest names to attract attention was Bobby Donati. Donati was an associate of the Patriarca crime family, known in law enforcement circles as a man deeply involved in theft and other criminal activities. According to later informants, Donati had allegedly boasted about his role in the Gardner job. Some claimed he told them he had been one of the men in the police uniforms. Others said he had been involved in hiding the art. Donati's violent death in 1991, found wounded in an attack in the trunk of a car, cut short any opportunity for questioning him directly. Yet in the lore of the Gardner case, his name never faded. Investigators considered the possibility that Donati had used the stolen art as leverage within the mob world, perhaps intending to negotiate with the Patriarca family during a period of internal strife. The paintings, in this theory, would not be trophies but bargaining chips. His death, however, left a silence no one could fill, and if Donati did possess or conceal any of the works, they disappeared with him. Closely tied to this line of thought was the figure of Bobby Guarente. Guarente was another organized crime associate with ties to both Boston and Philadelphia. According to statements made years later by his widow, Guarente had once been in possession of some of the stolen works, or at least had facilitated their transfer. She told authorities that Guarente had given several of the paintings to Robert Gentile, a Connecticut mobster who would become one of the most scrutinized individuals in the entire investigation. This claim gave investigators fresh impetus to pursue Gentile, convinced he might finally lead them to the art. Guarente himself had died in 2004, his alleged role left in the realm of second-hand accounts and unverified stories. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Gentile became central in the 2010s. The FBI raided his home in Manchester, Connecticut, more than once, digging up his backyard, scouring his basement, and even opening his shed. They found lists of the stolen works, coded references, and other suggestive materials. Prosecutors alleged that Gentile had tried to broker deals involving the paintings, possibly using them as a way to negotiate within the criminal world. Gentile himself denied everything. He insisted he had never possessed the art and had only heard rumors like everyone else. Despite the circumstantial evidence, no stolen works were ever recovered from him or connected properties. To some investigators, Gentile was the last living link to the Gardner paintings. When he died in 2021, many believed he took the secret with him, if he ever held it at all. The Gentile narrative exemplifies a pattern in the Gardner case: a promising lead, tantalizing hints, extensive law enforcement action, and then nothing. Time and again, investigators seemed on the verge of a breakthrough, only for the trail to vanish. It was as if the paintings themselves exerted a gravitational pull, drawing attention without yielding their location. Another name that inevitably arose in any discussion of Boston crime was James Whitey Bulger, the infamous Irish mob boss who controlled much of the city's underworld in the 1980s and 1990s. Bulger was notorious for violence, for his manipulation of informant networks, and for his eventual status as one of America's most wanted fugitives. The idea that Bulger could have orchestrated the Gardner theft gained traction in public imagination, if not in hard evidence. Supporters of this theory argued that the theft would have required protection and influence, both of which Bulger had in abundance. Yet no credible link was ever established. Bulger himself, after his capture in 2011, denied any role, though denials from such a figure carry little weight. Still, investigators generally came to believe that the Gardner heist was not his operation. If anything, it may have been tolerated or indirectly connected through the complex web of alliances and rivalries in Boston's underworld, but Bulger was unlikely to have been the mastermind. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Beyond Boston, theories stretched across the Atlantic. The Irish Republican Army was often mentioned in whispers, not because there was any definitive evidence, but because of the IRA's known involvement in smuggling and its appetite for alternative forms of currency. Art had occasionally surfaced in Ireland as collateral in arms deals, and the idea that the Gardner works might have traveled that route seemed plausible to some. Reports emerged of potential sightings, of paintings moved through safe houses or rural farms, of canvases hidden in crates. Yet the FBI's investigations abroad yielded no solid proof. Interpol and Irish authorities collaborated, but each rumor eventually collapsed under scrutiny. Still, the IRA theory persisted, feeding into the broader narrative that the paintings had been moved overseas, beyond the immediate reach of American investigators. In parallel, more speculative accounts placed the works in the Middle East or in South America, regions where art has occasionally surfaced in black market trades. One particularly persistent rumor claimed that the concert by Vermeer had been seen in Saudi Arabia, though no documentation or reliable testimony supported the claim. In the art world, such stories tend to multiply. The very fame of the missing works generates sightings much like those of mythical creatures. Without photographic or forensic confirmation, they remain anecdotes rather than leads. The FBI's official statements in 2013 and later confirmed that they believed the works had traveled through Connecticut and Philadelphia in the years after the theft. This was consistent with the Guerente Gentile narrative, suggesting that the art had at least been mobile within the United States. But after that, the trail went cold. Whether the works remain in America, hidden in private collections or storage, or whether they were moved abroad, remains unknown. The very uncertainty has become part of the fascination. As each lead fell apart, the Gardner case became a magnet for amateur sleuths and theorists. Independent investigators, journalists, and art historians constructed elaborate hypotheses, each pointing to different culprits. Some emphasized the apparent incompetence of the thieves in cutting canvases from their frames, arguing that this pointed to local burglars rather than sophisticated art criminals. Others noted the precision in targeting specific works, suggesting insider knowledge. The contradiction between these two impressions, the amateurish and the professional, remains unresolved. Perhaps the thieves were both, experienced criminals in some respects, reckless in others. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The role of the guards also continued to attract attention. Richard Abath, in particular, lived under a shadow for decades. Though never charged, he faced suspicion from many quarters. His decision to open the door to the disguised thieves was at minimum a critical lapse. Some investigators wondered whether he had been coerced, bribed, or otherwise involved. Years later, Abath gave interviews expressing his frustration with the suspicion, insisting he had been a victim, not a participant. Without hard evidence, the debate remained speculative. In a case defined by absences of paintings, of proof, of confessions, Abath's story became yet another unresolved thread. Meanwhile, the cultural impact of the theft deepened. Museums around the world reviewed their security systems, learning from the Gardner's vulnerabilities. The idea that two men in police uniforms could so easily bypass protocols was a sobering lesson. Institutions began investing more heavily in surveillance, in guard training, and in coordination with local law enforcement. The Gardner case thus became a catalyst for change, even as it remained unsolved. Over the years, law enforcement also tried less conventional tactics. Public appeals were made through newspapers, television, and even billboards. Composite sketches of the thieves were circulated, though after so much time, their utility was limited. Undercover operations attempted to draw out individuals who might be holding the art, but these efforts often collapsed once criminals realized the risks. The problem was not merely finding someone willing to talk, but finding someone who actually had access to the paintings rather than hearsay. Perhaps the most haunting element is the silence of the paintings themselves. Unlike other stolen goods, art cannot be disguised indefinitely. The Gardner works are instantly recognizable. They are cataloged in databases, reproduced in books, and studied in classrooms. To possess them is to hold something that can never be shown, and yet somewhere they must exist. The canvases may be rolled, the bronze goo boxed, the finial wrapped in cloth. They may sit in climate-controlled storage or languish in damp basements. They may be intact or damaged, preserved or neglected. The very uncertainty gives the case its power. Each possibility is both tragic and tantalizing. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. In this way, the Gardner theft is not only a criminal investigation, but a philosophical puzzle. What does it mean to steal art that cannot be sold? Is the motive profit, leverage, pride, or something stranger? Why take the concert but leave Titian's Europa? Why remove the finial, an object of relatively modest value, while ignoring others of immense worth? Was there a plan that failed, or were the choices haphazard? Each question remains open, feeding speculation without closure. The story of the Gardner heist is thus populated with ghosts. Donati had their lives taken before he could be interrogated. Guarente, gone with only his widow's testimony. Gentile, pursued to the end of his life without yielding the secret. Bulger, denying involvement even as the public insisted otherwise. Around them swirl rumors of Irish smugglers, Middle Eastern buyers, and unknown collectors. The FBI holds files thick with leads, yet the pages end in ellipses. The museum holds empty frames, a permanent exhibition of loss, and the public holds fascination, returning again and again to the story, as if retelling it might conjure the missing works into view. The Gardner theft has endured not only because of the missing works, but because of the peculiar resonance it has achieved in cultural memory. Most crimes, even dramatic ones, fade over time. They occupy headlines briefly, then dissolve into history. Yet this one has persisted, becoming almost archetypal. Part of the reason lies in the art itself. Another lies in the nature of museums as institutions, places that embody both vulnerability and permanence. And a third lies in the human fascination with unsolved mysteries, particularly those that touch the highest achievements of culture. Art theft is not uncommon. Works are stolen every year from private collections, from galleries, and occasionally from museums. But most such thefts involve smaller pieces, less famous works, or crimes of opportunity quickly solved. The Gardner theft was extraordinary in scale, in the fame of the objects and in the brazenness of the act. Vermeer's The Concert was not just valuable but irreplaceable. Rembrandt's stormy seascape was not merely another canvas, but the only seascape he ever painted. Such works are studied in classrooms, reproduced in countless books, and used to illustrate entire chapters of art history. Their disappearance is not just a matter of missing property, but of cultural dislocation. Imagine teaching the Dutch Golden Age and pointing not to an image on the wall of a museum, but to an empty frame. That void becomes a metaphor for absence itself. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The decision of the museum to leave the frames in place amplified this symbolism. Visitors walking through the Dutch room confront a sight that is at once ordinary and unsettling. Gilded frames surrounding nothing, preserved as relics of a crime. The absence is palpable, more eloquent than any plaque or explanation could be. It forces each person to imagine what once hung there, to reconstruct mentally the stolen images, and to reckon with loss. Few museums in the world display theft so openly. Most institutions, if robbed, would repair, replace, or rearrange. Gardner's stipulation that nothing be altered created a unique situation. A museum where the crime itself has become part of the collection. The theft is no longer external to the museum's story, but woven into it. This has created a paradoxical effect. The Gardner Museum, by all rights a jewel of Boston's cultural life, became equally famous for what it lacked as for what it contained. Tourists flock not only to see Titian, Botticelli, and tapestries, but also to see the empty frames. The voids are a destination. In this way, the theft expanded the museum's identity, drawing visitors who might otherwise have overlooked it. To some, this is an unfortunate irony. That Isabella Stewart Gardner's vision of her collection as a whole is now remembered partly through what was stolen. To others, it is an example of how institutions evolve, how even violation can become part of meaning. The cultural impact radiated outward as well. The Gardner heist became a fixture in the art world's imagination. Books appeared, each proposing explanations or dramatizations. Documentaries revisited the night of March 18, 1990, using interviews with investigators, guards, and experts to piece together timelines. Each production added layers to the story, feeding the public appetite while rarely advancing the investigation itself. The case's unsolved status made it endlessly recyclable. Unlike a solved crime which concludes, the Gardner story remains open-ended, allowing for perpetual retelling. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Hollywood, too, found the theft irresistible. Though no major film has yet been made directly about it, the tropes of art heists in cinema often echo its outlines. The use of disguise, the targeting of masterpieces, the question of insider knowledge. Viewers, primed by stories of clever thieves and secretive collectors, fold the Gardner theft into a larger cultural narrative about art crime. In this narrative, stolen masterpieces do not simply vanish. They become hidden treasures coveted by shadowy figures, stored in private vaults, waiting for rediscovery. Whether such images correspond to reality is secondary. The myth itself sustains fascination. Beyond entertainment, the theft influenced museum policy worldwide. Directors and security consultants studied the Gardner case as a cautionary tale. How could two men in police uniforms with no high technology defeat a major institution? The answers were sobering. The guards were undertrained, the protocols lax, and the security system outdated. The decision to prioritize visitor experience over stringent barriers left vulnerabilities. After 1990, many museums revisited their practices, investing in advanced surveillance, biometric access, and stricter guard procedures. The Gardner theft thus contributed to a global shift in how cultural heritage is protected. Yet even as it prompted improvements, the case also underscored a dilemma. Museums are meant to be accessible, inviting the public into contact with treasures of civilization. Too much security creates barriers, turning galleries into fortresses. Too little leaves them exposed. The Gardner theft highlighted this tension dramatically. The very charm of the museum, its intimate atmosphere, its sense of being a Venetian home rather than a sterile institution, was what made it vulnerable. To secure it as one would a bank would be to alter its character. The theft thus forced a reckoning. What is the balance between openness and protection in the stewardship of art? The case also influenced the discourse around cultural property. Art, unlike money or jewels, cannot be replaced. The theft of the concert was not simply a financial loss, but a subtraction from human history. This raised questions about responsibility. To whom do these works belong? To Boston, to the museum, to the global community? When they are stolen, it is not only the institution that suffers, but all who might have learned from them. The Gardner theft became a touchstone in debates about the fragility of cultural heritage, alongside stories of wartime looting and illicit trafficking. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Gardner case tapped into the psychology of mystery. People are drawn to unsolved puzzles, particularly when they involve elements of glamour and intellect. The theft was audacious yet baffling, amateurish in execution yet precise in certain choices. The works disappeared without trace, creating a riddle with no solution. Unlike the killing case, where closure may come through confessions or forensic evidence, an art theft relies on recovery. Until the paintings return, the story remains unfinished. This open-endedness fuels fascination. Each anniversary, each new rumor, each FBI statement reignites attention. The public is invited not just to observe, but to speculate, to imagine themselves as detectives. The case becomes participatory, a shared puzzle. This participatory quality is amplified by the museum's own approach. The Gardner has made the theft part of its narrative, not only through the empty frames, but through public outreach. It maintains a web page about the stolen works, offers rewards, and encourages information. Visitors leave not only with memories of art, but with questions, carrying the story outward. In this way, the museum has become a kind of co-author of the myth, sustaining interest even as it longs for resolution. There's also a deeper, almost literary resonance. The Gardner theft embodies themes that recur in myth and literature: disguise, forbidden treasure, vanished beauty, the search for the irretrievable. The two thieves in police uniforms could be figures from folklore, tricksters who deceive guardians. The stolen masterpieces become lost relics, hidden from the world, awaiting rediscovery. The empty frames resemble wounds or scars, visible signs of absence. This layering of narrative tropes makes the story compelling, even to those uninterested in art per se. It speaks to universal patterns of loss, deception, and longing. The theft's cultural afterlife also raises a paradox about fame. The Gardner works, already famous, became even more renowned after their disappearance. The concert is now arguably the world's most famous missing painting, its value not only monetary but symbolic. People who might never have known Vermeer's name now recognize the story of his lost canvas. In a strange way, the theft amplified the visibility of the works, even as it deprived the world of seeing them. This paradox underscores the peculiar power of absence. What is missing can sometimes loom larger than what is present. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Yet this fame has not translated into recovery. Indeed, it may have made recovery more difficult. The more attention the case receives, the harder it becomes for anyone to move or negotiate with the paintings. They are too recognizable, too famous. If they were intended as bargaining chips, the window for such use may have closed long ago. If they remain hidden, their guardians may fear exposure more than ever. Thus, the very fascination that keeps the case alive may also contribute to its stalemate. From an intellectual perspective, the Gardner theft also invites reflection on the nature of possession. What does it mean to own art? The museum owned the paintings, but their absence demonstrates how fragile ownership can be. If a Vermeer can vanish into private hands, what does that say about the security of cultural heritage? Conversely, if criminals possess it but cannot show or sell it, do they truly own it? The works become Schrödinger's paintings, simultaneously present and absent, owned and not owned, hidden yet public in memory. This ambiguity adds to the allure of the case as a philosophical puzzle. Over 3 decades later, the Gardner theft has become something larger than a crime. It is a cultural phenomenon, a story retold in classrooms, in galleries, in living rooms. It has shaped how we think about art, about crime, and about mystery itself. It has entered the pantheon of enduring enigmas, alongside the fate of Amelia Earhart, the identity of Jack the Ripper, and the disappearance of the Amber Room. Its uniqueness lies in the combination of the ordinary and the sublime. Two men in costumes, a small museum in Boston, and masterpieces of world art that vanished as if swallowed by time. By the mid-1990s, the Gardner theft had already cemented itself as a puzzle of international proportions. Yet as years turned into decades, the investigation itself became almost as storied as the crime. Each new lead was announced with cautious optimism. Each disappointment reinforced the sense of enigma. The FBI, local police, journalists, and amateur sleuths all pursued threads, weaving a tapestry of theories that grew denser over time. What emerged was not a single narrative, but a shifting constellation of possibilities, reflecting the complexity of crime, art, and human ambition. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. One of the most consistent features of the investigation was its tendency to circle back on itself. Early on, the FBI emphasized that the crime bore hallmarks of organized crime, particularly given Boston's well-documented underworld connections. Yet the choice of works, the rough handling of the canvases, and the lack of immediate monetization suggested something less sophisticated. Could hardened mobsters really have chosen such fragile targets without a clear plan for disposition? Conversely, could amateurs have succeeded in bypassing a major museum's security with such confidence? These contradictions fueled debate for years. Investigators pursued specific names. Some were notorious figures in Boston's criminal milieu, racketeers, smugglers, and enforcers. Others were less expected, small-time thieves with aspirations to greater exploits. Over time, many of these individuals died, were imprisoned for unrelated crimes, or were ruled out. Yet the pattern of leads suggested that the paintings, if they had survived, may have circulated in hidden networks, perhaps used as leverage in drug deals or as informal currency in the underworld. Unlike money, which is fungible, art holds symbolic capital. To possess a Vermeer, even hidden in a basement, is to wield a kind of power. Whether that power is practical or illusory remains debatable, but its allure is undeniable. In 2013, the FBI made a striking announcement. It declared publicly that it believed it had identified the thieves, two members of a New England crime group now deceased. The Bureau did not name them officially, but leaks and journalistic investigations suggested figures already known to law enforcement. The claim, however, left crucial gaps. If the thieves were dead, where were the paintings? The Bureau indicated that it believed the works had been moved through criminal channels, at times reaching Philadelphia, but ultimately vanishing from view. Without the art itself, the identification of perpetrators brought little closure. It was as if the outline of the crime had been sketched, but the heart of the mystery, the fate of the masterpieces, remained concealed. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. This announcement illustrated a key theme of the Gardner story, partial answers that never resolve the whole. Each development seemed to promise revelation, only to stop short of full disclosure. In some ways, this kept the public's fascination alive. An unsolved mystery invites speculation. A solved one closes the door. By identifying likely thieves but not recovering the art, the FBI both advanced and perpetuated the enigma. Meanwhile, the museum itself evolved. In 1990, it had been a quiet institution with local significance. By the 2000s, it had become internationally recognized, in part because of the theft. Its curators, directors, and trustees faced the delicate task of honoring Isabella Stewart Gardner's vision while also responding to the crime's shadow. They commissioned documentaries, cooperated with investigative reporting, and raised awareness of the reward for information. For years, the museum offered $5 million, later increasing it to $10 million, one of the largest private rewards in history. Yet the bounty did not yield results. Offers of information often led to dead ends, hoaxes, or rehashed rumors. The gap between incentive and outcome underscored the difficulty of penetrating the criminal silence surrounding the case. The guards who had been on duty that night lived the rest of their lives under suspicion. Though no evidence proved their complicity, doubts lingered. Some observers noted their apparent naivety in admitting the disguised men, while others argued they were simply victims of a clever ruse. Interviews with the guards revealed a mixture of regret, defensiveness, and resignation. They had become unwilling participants in a narrative larger than themselves. Their names forever linked to the crime, even if their role was merely unfortunate. The media's treatment of the case evolved too. In the 1990s, newspaper reports emphasized the sensational nature of the theft, highlighting the Vermeer and Rembrandt as priceless losses. By the 2000s, coverage became more reflective, exploring the cultural meaning of absence, the psychology of unsolved mysteries, and the intersection of art and crime. In recent years, podcasts and streaming documentaries brought the story to new audiences, framing it as a serialized puzzle. The case thus adapted to changing media landscapes, remaining relevant to generations that had not even been born when the theft occurred. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Each retelling carried a slightly different emphasis. Some leaned toward the romanticized image of brilliant thieves executing a flawless caper. Others underscored the banality of error, a poorly secured museum, sleepy guards, opportunistic criminals. This tension between glamour and reality reflects a broader human tendency to mythologize crime. The Gardner theft, in fact, may have been less an elegant scheme than a messy improvisation, but in memory it becomes something more, a parable about vulnerability and mystery. The FBI's confidence in having identified the thieves did not end the proliferation of alternative theories. Some writers have speculated that the works were stolen to order for a private collector, echoing cinematic tropes. Others suggested they may have been destroyed, either deliberately or through neglect. Canvases cut from frames, rolled, and stored improperly could easily deteriorate beyond recovery. This possibility is difficult to face, as it would mean that Vermeer's The Concert no longer exists in any form. Yet absence of evidence leaves room for hope. Until definitive proof emerges, the imagination supplies possibilities. The cultural footprint of the theft deepened as anniversaries passed. On the 25th anniversary in 2015, exhibitions and media coverage reflected on the endurance of the mystery. Visitors continued to stand before the empty frames, photographs circulated anew, and debates reignited. Each milestone served as both commemoration and reminder. The case is not solved, the works are not returned, the loss remains real. The frames themselves, by now, had acquired a patina of symbolism, functioning almost like memorials. They speak silently of absence, crime, and persistence. For the museum staff, the challenge has been to balance mourning with vitality. The Gardner is not simply the site of a theft. It is a living institution with ongoing exhibitions, concerts, and educational programs. Its Venetian courtyard still blooms with seasonal plantings. Its galleries still house masterpieces untouched by the crime. Yet the theft cannot be ignored. The curators live with the dual identity of the museum, guardian of great art and custodian of one of history's greatest mysteries. In this sense, the theft did not merely scar the institution, it transformed its identity. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. From a broader perspective, the Gardner case has shaped how society understands the relationship between crime and art. It illustrates the paradox that art, though priceless, is physically vulnerable. It can be cut from frames, carried down stairwells, loaded into cars. Its value lies not in its physical robustness, but in its cultural meaning. That such meaning can be imperiled by ordinary criminality underscores the fragility of heritage. At the same time, the persistence of the Gardner story shows how meaning can endure even when objects are absent. The missing works remain alive in imagination, textbooks, and conversation. In a sense, they continue to exert influence despite their disappearance. The case also raises enduring questions about justice. If the thieves are dead, what justice remains possible? Recovery of the art would be a form of restitution, but absent that, the crime remains unresolved in a deeper sense. Unlike many criminal cases where closure comes through punishment, the Gardner case places emphasis on restoration. The goal is not retribution, but return. This shifts the focus from law to culture, from courts to museums. It is less about who is guilty than about what is lost. As the decades advance, the likelihood of recovery seems both diminished and strangely resilient. On one hand, if the works have not surfaced after so long, perhaps they never will. On the other, history offers examples of masterpieces reappearing after centuries in hiding. The Nazi looting of World War II scattered thousands of works, many of which resurfaced in unexpected places decades later. In that sense, time need not erase hope. A Vermeer could yet emerge from a storage room, a Rembrandt from an attic. Until then, the Gardner case remains suspended in uncertainty. That uncertainty is perhaps its most compelling feature. It keeps the public engaged, the investigators searching, the museum vigilant. It ensures that the Gardner theft remains not a closed chapter, but a living story. Visitors who step into the Dutch room today are part of that story. They see not only what Isabella Stewart Gardner assembled, but also what was taken. They stand in the presence of absence, experiencing a unique blend of beauty and loss. The museum has become both sanctuary and stage, a place where art and crime intersect in enduring mystery. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. In the end, the Gardner theft resists neat resolution. It is not merely an unsolved crime, but a phenomenon that has grown larger than its origins. It encompasses art history, criminology, cultural memory, and collective imagination. Its details, 2 men in police uniforms, 13 stolen works, empty frames, have become iconic. Its unanswered questions continue to provoke thought. Where are the paintings? Who holds them? Will they ever return? These questions ensure that the story retains vitality generation after generation. And so the frames remain, gilded and empty, poised between past and future. They are reminders of what was lost, symbols of what endures, and invitations to wonder. Whether the stolen works lie in darkness or await rediscovery, the mystery itself has entered history. The Gardner Museum continues, alive with art and music, yet always shadowed by absence. In that shadow lies the heart of the story. A crime unresolved, a heritage interrupted, and a mystery that continues to whisper, drawing us closer, urging us to imagine what we cannot see. On the first morning of December in 1948, the quiet beach at Somerton, just south of Adelaide in South Australia, held a mystery that would outlive its discoverers. A man lay propped against the seawall, his legs extended neatly, his feet crossed as though in repose. At first glance, he might have been a passerby who had simply paused to rest, lulled into sleep by the rhythm of waves. Yet when concerned beachgoers drew closer, the stillness of his form told another story. The man was not sleeping, he was dead. What distinguished this discovery from the countless other unexplained deaths catalogued in police records was the peculiar absence of explanation. The man carried no wallet, no money, no papers. The labels had been cut from his clothes. His suit was of good quality, his shoes polished, his appearance neat. He bore no obvious wounds, no signs of a struggle. Even the expression on his face, calm and composed, seemed to resist the idea of sudden distress. He was simply there, without name, without past, without cause. From the beginning, the Somerton man invited interpretation, and each interpretation led only to more questions. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Police arrived quickly, drawn by the strangeness of the report. An unidentified body on a public beach was unusual enough. The presentation of the man made it more so. His pockets were searched. They yielded ordinary items, bus tickets, a packet of chewing gum, matches, combs. Nothing pointed to identity. The tickets suggested he had taken a bus and train into the area, but not why. Witnesses offered recollections that grew hazy under scrutiny. A couple had seen him the night before, slumped in the same position, raising an arm as though to ward off mosquitoes. To them, he looked drunk, though no alcohol was later found in his system. Another man reported seeing someone carried on the shoulders of companions near that spot, though whether that sighting related to the dead man was uncertain. Memory blurred easily when asked to serve as evidence. The coroner's examination deepened the mystery. The man was in good physical condition, about 40 to 50 years old, with well-developed calves, a detail noted as though it might matter. His organs revealed no clear trauma, no bullet, no knife wound, no internal bleeding. Yet the stomach contained traces that some pathologists thought might suggest poison. If poison had been administered, it left no obvious residue, leading investigators to speculate about rare substances that might kill without trace. Such possibilities, digitalis, strophanthine, were consistent with symptoms reported in witness testimony, such as the man's apparent convulsions or weakness on the beach. Yet the toxicology reports were inconclusive. The pathologist remarked it was likely poisoning, but by a substance then unknown to science. That remark alone sealed the case's aura of enigma. Attention turned to the man's clothing. His suit was American in style, his shoes unusual for local manufacture. The removed labels suggested deliberate concealment. Why strip a body of brand identifiers unless anonymity were desired? Some speculated he had been a traveler from overseas, perhaps recently arrived. His dental records were checked against registries in Australia and abroad, but no match was found. His fingerprints were sent internationally, including to the FBI, but again no record emerged. He seemed to exist outside of bureaucratic memory, a blank in the age of documentation. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Weeks later, another detail surfaced that shifted the puzzle into new terrain. Among his possessions, police found a hidden pocket in his waistband. In it was a small scrap of paper, neatly rolled, bearing 2 Persian words in type, tamam shud. Translated, they meant ended or finished. The phrase was recognized as the closing words of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book of quatrains popular in translation during the early 20th century. The presence of such a scrap, cut from a printed page, was bizarre. It implied intentionality, as if someone, or the man himself, wished to leave a cryptic final message. Police scoured bookshops and libraries, seeking a copy of the Rubaiyat from which the page had been torn. Then came an extraordinary coincidence. A local man reported that months earlier he had discovered a copy of the Rubaiyat tossed onto the back seat of his car, parked near Somerton Beach. In its final page, a rectangular piece was missing, corresponding exactly to the scrap found on the body. The connection seemed undeniable. This book, now in police hands, became the centerpiece of the case. Within it were further mysteries. Scrawled faintly in pencil on its back cover were several lines of letters, apparently grouped as a code. Attempts to decipher it have continued ever since, with cryptographers, amateur and professional, debating whether it represents an actual cipher, an acrostic, or merely random marks. At the time, Australian military experts analyzed it but reached no conclusion. The code remains unbroken. The book also contained a telephone number, leading to a young nurse living in nearby Glenelg. She had once owned a copy of the Rubaiyat, which she had given years earlier to an army lieutenant named Alfred Boxall. Investigators suspected a link. Perhaps the dead man was Boxall, returned to Adelaide. But when Boxall was located alive and well in Sydney, the trail shifted again. The nurse, who became known in records as Jestin, denied knowing the dead man, though when shown the plaster cast of his face, she reportedly reacted with visible shock. She insisted she had no connection, yet police remained unconvinced. Her reluctance to be publicly associated with the case fueled speculation that the dead man might have been a spurned lover, a rejected suitor, or someone from a past she wished to conceal. Whatever the truth, she never changed her story, and the puzzle of her relationship to the Somerton man remained unresolved until her death decades later. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. By this point, the case had attracted wide attention. The blend of espionage, romance, and exotic literature seemed to belong less to ordinary crime than to a tale of mystery. The Rubaiyat itself, with its themes of fate, mortality, and the fleeting nature of life, provided a poetic backdrop that encouraged speculation. Was Tamam Shud a suicide note, a declaration of finality chosen by the man himself? Or was it planted, a message from others to signal the end of his life? In either case, the gesture felt deliberate, layered with symbolism. This sense of staging, the neat clothing, the cryptic scrap, the obscure code, gave the case a texture of narrative, as though constructed to baffle. The authorities buried the man in Adelaide Cemetery in 1949, under a simple headstone reading, "Here lies the unknown man found at Somerton Beach, first deck in 1948. His body was embalmed, and a plaster cast of his head and upper torso made, preserving his likeness for future reference. That cast, displayed at the South Australian Police Museum, became an object of fascination. Viewers gazed at his calm, handsome features, preserved in plaster, seeking clues in cheekbones, lips, the angle of the eyes. His physical presence was gone, yet his image endured, sustaining the enigma. In the decades that followed, the Somerton man became a subject of continuing fascination. Each new investigator, journalist, or amateur sleuth approached the puzzle with fresh angles. Some emphasized espionage. The late 1940s were years of Cold War tension, with Adelaide hosting sensitive military research sites. A man carrying secret codes connected to a woman with nursing and possible intelligence contacts might well have been a spy. His death by untraceable poison fit the pattern of clandestine elimination. Others rejected espionage in favor of personal drama. Perhaps he was a jilted lover, leaving behind the final word finished as testament to rejection. Perhaps the nurse Jeston had known him more closely than she admitted and feared scandal if the truth emerged. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Forensic detail continued to fascinate. His calves, described as unusually well developed, suggested to some he had been a dancer or athlete. His hands bore no signs of manual labor, implying a white-collar life. His teeth included a rare anomaly. The lateral incisors were missing, an unusual trait noted by dentists. Each feature seemed a potential lead, yet none yielded definitive identification. The mystery lay not in lack of detail, but in surplus. Too many fragments existed, but none aligned into certainty. As time passed, the Somerton case entered a realm of legend. It was told in books, radio programs, television documentaries. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the poetry, the code, the nurse's denial, the theory of poison. The calmness of his death scene, neat suit, crossed legs, composed face, contrasted with the turbulence of speculation it generated. He seemed almost designed for enigma, a cipher embodied. Even official re-examinations brought little clarity. The coroner's verdict remained inconclusive. Cause of death unknown. The police case file thickened with reports, interviews, photographs, but no resolution. The absence of closure itself became part of the story. Each generation rediscovered him, drawn by the mixture of fact and mystery, by the eerie stillness of a man who appeared more like a story than a corpse. As decades unfolded, the Somerton man refused to fade into obscurity. Each retelling added depth, not resolution. Investigators, journalists, and ordinary enthusiasts returned to the beach, the cast, and the fragile paper scrap like pilgrims revisiting a shrine. The puzzle seemed inexhaustible, as if each unanswered question carried within it the promise of more. Among the earliest and most persistent theories was espionage. The timing seemed suggestive. In 1948, the world had barely emerged from the upheaval of the Second World War. The Cold War had already begun its long chill, with intelligence services operating at heightened intensity. Australia, though distant from Europe, was not untouched. It played host to testing ranges, research facilities, and communications links valuable to allies and adversaries alike. Adelaide itself housed laboratories and military establishments. Against this backdrop, the discovery of a man who might have died from a rare poison, with coded notes in his book, seemed almost too neatly aligned with spycraft to ignore. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Supporters of this theory pointed to the secrecy surrounding the nurse known as Jeston. Some speculated that her past might have included connections to intelligence work, perhaps through her association with military personnel during the war. Her reluctance to speak publicly about the dead man and the visible shock she displayed when shown his cast were interpreted as evidence of a concealed link. If the Somerton man had been involved in clandestine activities, her silence could have been protective, either of herself, her family, or even her country. Yet no documentation has ever confirmed espionage. No foreign service claimed him. No declassified archive has revealed his name. If he were a spy, he was one erased beyond recovery. To others, this absence suggested a different truth: that the man was not an intelligence operative, but an ordinary figure whose unexplained death became entangled with Cold War imagination. The alternative narrative was of personal drama. The Tamam Shud fragment, meaning finished, lent itself to romantic interpretation. Perhaps the man had been involved with Jeston or another woman, and the word signified despair at rejection. Suicide remained a possibility in official records. If he had ingested poison himself, the absence of external trauma would be explained, as would the presence of the Rubaiyat fragment, a poetic farewell, chosen with deliberation. Yet questions remained. Where would he have acquired a poison so elusive? Why remove the labels from his clothes? Why conceal his identity so thoroughly? Suicide, though plausible, seemed incomplete. The forensic details of his physique generated further speculation. Pathologists remarked on the man's strong calf muscles, the sort developed through years of running, dancing, or military drill. His pointed toes suggested he had often worn footwear unsuited to wide feet, perhaps dancing shoes. To some, this implied a past as a ballet dancer or professional performer. Others noted the absence of calluses or heavy wear on his hands, suggesting he had not engaged in manual labor. His life, whatever it was, did not align with hard physical work. These impressions built a profile at once precise and frustrating, a man of care, neatness, and physical grace, but without name or story. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The book discovered in the car remained central. Its penciled code intrigued cryptographers. The sequence of letters appeared structured, with repetitions and groupings that suggested pattern. Yet no method of decipherment succeeded. The possibility that it was an acrostic, initial letters of words in a message, remained viable but unprovable. Others proposed it was a form of shorthand known only to the writer. The allure of a secret message persisted, giving the case an aura of deliberate enigma. Another element emerged decades later that deepened the mystery. In 1949, during the inquest, Justin's infant son was briefly mentioned in police reports, though not investigated. Observers noted, years afterward, a resemblance between the boy's features and those of the Somerton man, particularly a rare ear shape and dental anomaly. This resemblance, highlighted by later researchers, suggested the possibility that the man had been the child's father. If true, the story shifted from espionage to intimate tragedy, a man seeking a woman, perhaps turned away, perhaps dying nearby in circumstances never fully explained. Justin herself never acknowledged such a connection. She lived quietly, maintaining silence whenever the case arose. Modern technology gradually entered the investigation. In the early 2000s, efforts were made to re-examine the preserved hair from the plaster cast. Mitochondrial DNA analysis was attempted, though results were limited by sample quality. Later, forensic genealogists proposed that advanced techniques could establish familial links, potentially leading to identification. Yet access to the remains was restricted for decades, with legal and ethical debates about exhumation. Not until 2021 were the Somerton man's remains officially exhumed by South Australian authorities for full DNA sequencing, a step that promised to bring the mystery into the age of genetic genealogy. Before that moment, speculation continued almost unchecked. Was he a European refugee, one of many displaced by the Second World War, arriving anonymously in Australia? Was he a seaman, perhaps slipped ashore from a vessel, his identity obscured in the transient world of ports? Some noted that his clothes bore stitching of a style uncommon in Australia, but typical of American manufacture. This suggested transnational movement, though no passenger list bore his name. He remained untethered, a figure in transit with no documented arrival or departure. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The possibility of rare poisons continued to fascinate medical historians. Digitalis, derived from foxglove, was capable of producing symptoms consistent with those observed, yet should have been detectable in chemical tests of the era. The suggestion that a rarer cardiac glycoside might have been used was more tantalizing. Such substances could cause rapid death with minimal trace, fitting the espionage hypothesis. Yet they could also be acquired by someone in medical or pharmaceutical circles, linking back again to the possibility of personal tragedy connected to the nurse. Each theory branched into sub-theories, none conclusive. Enthusiasts built elaborate narratives: a Soviet spy eliminated for failure, a rejected suitor choosing death, a professional dancer with a secret past. Each relied on the same fragments: the scrap, the code, the nurse's silence, arranged into different configurations. The very minimalism of evidence made the case fertile ground for imagination. Through all of this, the image of the Somerton man endured. The plaster bust, displayed under glass, became a magnet for those who sought to study his features. Visitors remarked on the serenity of his face, the slight curl of hair, the firmness of his jaw. He looked not like a victim, but like a figure waiting to be awakened. a riddle embodied. His anonymity gave him a paradoxical presence. He was everyone and no one, simultaneously intimate and unreachable. By the 1970s and 1980s, the case had entered folklore. Journalists revisited it on anniversaries, often under headlines stressing the world's most baffling mystery. Television programs presented it with reenactments, showing actors lying against the seawall, reciting fragments of the Rubaiyat. For the public, it became less about crime and more about atmosphere. The quiet beach at dawn, the man in the suit, the words "Tamam Shud" folded in a pocket. The story appealed not for its violence but for its calm enigma. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The man's grave, marked simply, became a place of occasional pilgrimage. Flowers appeared there, left anonymously. Whether by family, friends, or strangers moved by the mystery, no one knew. The headstone, "Unknown Man," spoke to a universal human fear, to depart without name, without remembrance. And yet, paradoxically, the Somerton man was remembered more than most. His anonymity gave him permanence, making him part of collective imagination. When the possibility of DNA testing arose, it seemed to promise closure. Perhaps at last his family would be found, his origins traced. Yet closure itself posed questions. Would solving the case diminish its aura? Would naming the Somerton man reduce him from myth to man, from cipher to citizen? Some welcomed the thought. Others sensed that mystery itself was the essence, that solving it might unravel something ineffable. Still, the investigation pressed on, a balance between respect for the dead and pursuit of truth. With each decade, the Somerton man became not only a case file but a symbol of how much can remain hidden, even in plain sight, of how history records events without always recording people, of how the simplest details, a scrap of paper, a code of letters, can resist resolution across generations. By the turn of the 21st century, the Somerton man's story had become a fixture in both local memory and global lore. With the rise of the internet, forums and dedicated websites began to gather scattered fragments of information, creating communities of amateur sleuths. For many, the appeal lay not in the promise of resolution, but in the experience of sifting through minutiae, treating the case as an open book of unanswered questions. The Rubaiyat, the clothing, the medical notes, the nurse known as Jestin, all became subjects of endless rereading, as if meaning might emerge not from discovery but from repetition. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Digital technology made possible new ways of revisiting old evidence. Photographs of the handwritten code were scanned and distributed, allowing cryptographers and hobbyists worldwide to apply algorithms, frequency analyses, and comparative tests. Yet the code yielded no definitive breakthrough. It resisted translation into words, resisted alignment with known ciphers, resisted even the comfort of classification. It seemed to embody unreadability itself, an artifact whose power came from withholding meaning. At the same time, archival documents were re-examined. Passenger manifests, immigration records, and missing persons files were searched with renewed rigor. Still, no matching identity surfaced. The absence itself deepened the enigma. How could a man in a modern urban society leave so little trace? Some speculated he might have lived under an assumed name, or come from a background already fractured by war, displacement, or deliberate concealment. Others suggested clerical gaps or destroyed records, reminders of how fragile documentation could be. The Somerton man was less a ghost than a silhouette, sharply outlined yet without substance. In 2010, new attention was drawn to the possibility of familial connections. A researcher studying the physical anomalies, particularly the man's ear and dental structure, suggested that they might be heritable traits. Comparing them with photographs of Jestin's son, the resemblance seemed striking. If accurate, this would place the Somerton man within a hidden family narrative, suggesting he had been known, if not acknowledged, in life. The possibility of paternity reframed the case as a story of personal secrecy rather than global intrigue. Yet without direct genetic evidence, the suggestion remained unproven, suspended between speculation and truth. Meanwhile, the Rubaiyat itself acquired an almost talismanic role. The copy found in the car was one of a very small edition, with only a handful known worldwide. The rarity of the book meant that its connection to the dead man was unlikely to be coincidence. Some saw it as a cipher book, its verses used as a key. Others saw it as a symbol, chosen for its themes of fate and impermanence. The final words, Tamam Shud, finished, invited reflection not only on the man's death, but on the ephemeral nature of all stories. Perhaps the note was not meant as a puzzle at all, but simply as a poetic closure, a last gesture from someone who wished to leave quietly. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. When South Australia's Attorney General authorized exhumation in 2021, decades of speculation seemed to pivot toward resolution. Advances in forensic genealogy had transformed cold cases around the world. By tracing minute DNA sequences and comparing them against public databases, investigators could build family trees that reached across continents and generations. For the first time, it seemed possible that the Somerton man might be not only identified but placed within a lineage. The exhumation itself was conducted with solemnity. After so many years, the act of disturbing the grave carried symbolic weight. Yet there was also a sense of continuity, as though the investigation were merely resuming after a long pause. While the results of analysis have been reported in fragments, with researchers suggesting potential names and connections, official confirmation has remained slow and careful. Genealogical reconstructions are complex, dependent on the availability of comparative samples and the interpretation of branching family lines. In a sense, the pursuit of identity shifted from the man himself to the broader web of relatives he might belong to. He became less an individual and more a node in a vast unfolding network. And yet, even as science approached answers, the mystery retained its shape. To know a name might explain bureaucratic absence, but would not necessarily clarify why he died, why he traveled, or why he carried those particular objects. DNA could locate him in a family tree, but could not decipher the code in the book. It could suggest origins, but not motivations. The Somerton man remained, in essence, resistant to finality. Writers and filmmakers who revisited the story often emphasized this resistance. They spoke of him not as a riddle to be solved, but as a meditation on incompleteness. His presence on the beach, the neatness of his clothing, the faint suggestion of intention, all created an atmosphere where certainty seemed beside the point. He embodied the tension between fact and unknowability, inviting contemplation rather than conclusion. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The beach itself changed over the years. Where once he had been found in near solitude, later decades saw development, tourism, and daily bustle. Yet in the early morning, when the light is soft and the tide murmurs against the sand, it is still possible to imagine the scene of 1948, the body unnoticed through the night, the world only slowly awakening. In this liminal space between day and night, between memory and forgetting, the Somerton man continues to reside. The enduring fascination may lie not in who he was, but in what he represents. He is the unknown in an age that prides itself on knowledge, the unresolved within a culture of resolution. His silence offers contrast to the endless production of information that defines modern life. He remains still while interpretations swirl, timeless while decades pass. In this sense, he is less a subject of crime history than a figure of meditation, a reminder of how little can be grasped with certainty. Some observers have suggested that the case's persistence is itself part of its meaning. That we continue to look, despite decades of failure, shows the human need to seek pattern and story. The Somerton man is unfinished, and therefore perpetually compelling. Each generation reads the fragments anew, projecting its own anxieties and desires onto the empty spaces. During the Cold War, he was a spy. During later years, he was a lost lover or a hidden father. In the age of genetics, he becomes a puzzle of DNA. His image reflects the concerns of the moment, a mirror more than a portrait. As night falls, the case takes on a different resonance. The quiet, the slow rhythm of waves, the imagined presence of a man whose story remains untold, all combine into an atmosphere of calm uncertainty. The Somerton man becomes less a problem to solve than a companion in the space between wakefulness and sleep. His mystery is not sharp but gentle, not urgent but lingering. Like the final words in his pocket, the story does not demand explanation so much as acceptance. finished yet not resolved. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. And so, across more than 70 years, the Somerton man remains where he was first found, at the threshold. He is neither fully identified nor entirely unknown, neither spy nor lover, neither victim nor agent. He rests in a state of suspension, a quiet presence in history, reminding us that not all questions are meant to be answered. Some are meant simply to accompany us, to be returned to in the still hours, when the world itself feels like a puzzle, just beyond comprehension. As we leave his story for now, it remains open, its details waiting for another reading, another interpretation. The sea continues its rhythm, the sand shifts with each tide, and the memory of the Somerton man endures, not as a riddle to be solved tonight, but as a companion to thought and rest. Over the years, as researchers moved closer to a potential identification, another question surfaced. What does it mean to know someone only through fragments? In museums, we piece together the lives of ancient people from shards of pottery or the outline of a footprint. The Somerton man, though modern, exists in a similar way. We do not hear his voice or read his letters. Instead, we follow the trail of a torn scrap, the pattern of stitching in a jacket, the arrangement of letters on a page. His story is built not from abundance but from scarcity, and that scarcity creates its own resonance. The comparison to archaeology is not accidental. Just as archaeologists speak of stratigraphy, layers of soil preserving traces of the past, the case of the Somerton man reveals layers of interpretation. The first layer is the body on the beach, a simple fact of discovery. The next is the inquest, adding the medical evidence, the inconclusive talk of poison. Another layer is the rubaiyat, then the nurse, then the code. Each decade adds its own stratum: Cold War suspicion, forensic hope, genetic analysis. The figure himself does not change, but the surrounding narrative grows richer, like sediment building around a stone. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. It is perhaps for this reason that the mystery resists resolution. Each new suggestion does not erase the previous ones, but coexists with them. The Somerton man is simultaneously a spy, a lover, a refugee, and a forgotten performer. Each identity is plausible, none definitive. To resolve him into one would be to collapse the multiplicity that gives the story its enduring pull. In this way, he resembles the poetry of Omar Khayyam, with its verses inviting many readings. The rubaiyat does not give answers, it offers reflections, layered and shifting. The fragment in his pocket may have been less a statement than an invitation to read the world as unfinished verse. When forensic genealogists began releasing tentative results, pointing toward a name of possible Eastern European descent, some greeted it as revelation. At last, here was a lineage, a potential origin in the turmoil of early 20th century migration. Yet even this did not satisfy everyone. A name may provide coordinates on a map of ancestry, but it does not reveal why a man traveled to Australia, why he ended his days on a beach, or why he carried a book with coded marks. Identification answers one question, but leaves the greater puzzle intact. Consider again the code penciled in the rubaiyat. Despite sophisticated computer analyses, its meaning remains closed. Some cryptographers suggest it might not be a code at all, but a set of initials used as reminders, personal mnemonics. Others maintain that its patterns show structure too deliberate to be random. The letters sit there still like hieroglyphs awaiting their Rosetta Stone. They remind us that some languages are private, some systems meant only for the one who created them. If so, the code is less a key for us than a trace of another life's internal logic, forever sealed. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. The nurse known as Jestin also became, in a sense, part of the mystery's fabric. She lived a long life, passing away in the early 2000s, never offering public comment. To those who studied her, this silence itself became an eloquent statement. Was she protecting her privacy, guarding her family, or simply uninterested in speculation? Silence, like the code, can be interpreted endlessly. Some saw guilt, others discretion. But perhaps silence was simply silence, a refusal to let a single event define her existence. And yet in the collective imagination, she became a central figure, her quietness amplifying the mystery rather than diminishing it. In recent years, artists and writers have turned to the Somerton man as a metaphor. Painters have depicted him as a figure in repose, surrounded by abstract waves and coded letters. Novelists have imagined his inner thoughts in the final hours, though always with restraint, never daring to fill the void completely. Even musicians have composed works inspired by the case, weaving repetition and unresolved chords into soundscapes that mirror the irresolution of the story. The man has become less an individual than a symbol of mystery itself, an emblem of the unfinished. His grave, once marked only by unknown man, has become a quiet place of contemplation. Visitors sometimes report a sense of calm there, as though the mystery itself radiated stillness. Flowers left on anniversaries testify to remembrance without knowledge, mourning without identity. This paradox, grief for a stranger, reminds us of the human impulse to connect, even across the boundaries of anonymity. The Somerton man is not known, and yet he is remembered. That tension has given him a kind of immortality. As science continues, it is likely that his name will eventually be confirmed. If so, we will know something new, but not everything. Perhaps he will be revealed as a migrant from Europe, or a man estranged from family, or someone traveling for reasons never to be reconstructed. Perhaps he will remain ambiguous even in identity, with multiple candidates and uncertain lines. Either way, the essence of the mystery endures, for identity is only part of the story. What captivates is not the record of birth, but the image of a man lying on the sand at dawn, neat in dress, silent in death, carrying with him a final scrap of verse. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. And so the story remains open, not because it cannot be closed, but because openness is its nature. Each retelling reshapes it slightly, allowing it to live in the imagination as something more than a solved case. The Somerton man reminds us that history is not always about resolution, but about reflection. Some figures remain to ask us questions rather than provide answers. As we linger with his story tonight, let us allow the quiet to settle. Imagine the beach, the horizon softened by early light, the sound of waves steady and unhurried. Imagine the man as he was found, peaceful, composed, unmarked by struggle. There is no fear here, no urgency, only stillness. His presence is like a threshold, an invitation to drift between known and unknown, waking and sleep. And as the tide recedes and returns, we too may let our thoughts drift. The Somerton man will remain, unchanged yet ever renewed in memory. His mystery will accompany us, not as a burden, but as a gentle presence, reminding us of the beauty in what cannot be explained. Like the fragment in his pocket, the story too may end with two simple words, finished yet never truly complete. So let us close here for now, with quiet respect for the unknown. May the Somerton man rest, and may his mystery guide us softly into the night. Thank you for staying with me through this story. The mystery remains, quiet and unresolved, like the sound of the ocean at night. Some questions do not need immediate answers. They simply rest in our thoughts, waiting to be returned to another time. For now, it is enough to let the story drift into the background like a gentle tide. Allow your mind to soften, your breathing to slow, and let the calm of this moment carry you into rest. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers. Sleep well, and may your night be peaceful. Good night. Now let the stories rest like soft embers. Breathe slowly and allow the quiet to settle. The details remain, gentle and distant, like stars behind a thin cloud. In the quiet of the night, truth often whispers.